Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The first thing I felt was the paper. It was not the crisp, dry leaf of a new journal, promising empty days and the clean scent of ink. This paper was different. It had a texture like damp skin, a faint give under my fingertips, as if the fibers had absorbed the very cold of this place and now held it close, a secret chill that bled into my hand. I ran my thumb across the page, feeling the microscopic ridges and valleys, and I knew then that this record would not be a simple log of temperatures and coordinates. It would be a confession, pressed into a surface that felt unnervingly alive. We called our little outpost Terminus, a dramatic name for a cluster of modular pods huddled on the endless white plain of the Arctic, a handful of geometric scars against a canvas of absolute nothing. The sun had abandoned us 6 weeks prior, a slow, sinking funeral that left behind a perpetual, star-strewn twilight. The darkness here is not like the darkness of a room at night. It is a physical presence, a weight that presses against the triple-paned glass of the portholes. A deep, silent ocean in which we are the only sinking lights. There are 4 of us, or rather, there were 4 of us. Dr. Eris Thorne, the leader, a man whose mind is a cathedral of ice-cold logic and geological timelines. He sees the world in layers of rock and eons, a perspective that offers him a comforting distance from the petty scale of human dread. Then there is Lieutenant Sam Flynn, our survival expert, all coiled muscle and pragmatic grit. He trusts his rifle, his knots, and the measurable world. Lena Petrova, the biologist, is a quiet woman with eyes the color of the glacial sea. She speaks less than the rest of us, but she sees more, her attention often captured by the microscopic life that clings to existence in this frozen hell. And then there is me, Dominic Reed, the documentarian, the chronicler, the man with a damp paper journal and 2 sensitive ears. And there is Juno, my Juno Depp. A Siberian husky with a coat the color of moonlight and eyes that hold a shard of the ancient wild intelligence of wolves. She's my companion, my warmth in the bunk above mine, the soft, breathing engine of life in this sterile, mechanized environment. The first sign was not a sound or sight. It was a smell. I noted it on day 38 of the polar night. I was outside, performing the ritualistic check on the atmospheric sensors, my headlamp a frail darting insect in the immense dark. The air is usually so clean, it feels like you are breathing shards of glass, scoured of all impurity. But that night, just for a moment, the wind shifted and brought with it a new scent. It was the smell of wet stone, of a riverbed exposed after a long drought, a mineral dampness that spoke of deep, lightless places. It was gone as quickly as it came, but Juno caught it too. She stopped, her entire body rigid, her nose pointed into the blackness. A low growl vibrated in her chest, a sound I had never heard from her before. Not a warning to a visible threat, but a deep, primal confusion. She was not barking at something. She was questioning the very air. I mentioned it to the others over a dinner of rehydrated stew. The mess pod was warm, filled with the hum of the generators, a fragile pocket of humanity. A smell? Flynn grunted, not looking up from his tray. Probably a seal carcass thawing somewhere, or your own head getting cabin fever, Don. Thorne nodded, his fingers steepled. The mind under sensory deprivation is a fascinating thing. It begins to populate the void, pareidolia, We see faces in rock formations, we hear voices in the wind. Why not assign smells to the emptiness? Lena said nothing. She simply looked at me. Her spoon paused halfway to her lips, and in her sea-colored eyes, I saw not dismissal, but a flicker of recognition. She had smelled it too. She gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent plea to let it go. So I did, but the silence began to change. The polar night is not truly silent. There's the constant low thrum of the generators, the creak and pop of the settlement's structure as it contracted in the brutal cold, the hiss of the heating vents. These were the sounds of our own creation, the heartbeat of Terminus. Beyond that was the wind, a mournful, endless hymn. But now, layered under the wind, was something else. A sound like a breath being drawn over gravel. It was so low, so deeply woven into the fabric of the ambient noise, that I could never be sure I was truly hearing it. It was a sound felt more in the bones than in the ears, a resonant frequency of dread. I started staying up later than the others, sitting in the dim light of the common area with my journal, the damp paper under my hand, Juno asleep at my feet. I would turn off all the lights, except for a single small lamp, and just listen. The generators hummed. The wind sang its lonely song. And underneath it all, that slow, grinding inhalation. It felt like the landscape itself was breathing, a sleeping leviathan of ice and rock, dreaming beneath us. Flynn began to change. The pragmatic soldier started to become meticulous to the point of obsession. He checked the door locks not once, not twice, but 5, 6, 7 times before retiring. He would stand at the porthole for hours, his forehead pressed against the cold glass, staring out into the abyss, his rifle slung over his shoulder. When I asked him what he was looking for, he just shook his head. Movement, he'd mutter. Just movement. But there was nothing out there to move. Nothing but the shifting snow and the hypnotic dance of the aurora far to the north. Thorne retreated further into his data, his face lit by the cool blue glow of his monitors. He was mapping subterranean ice formations, and he claimed he was finding anomalies, vast empty spaces that shouldn't exist according to all our models. "It's like a lung," he whispered one night, more to himself than to me, a series of colossal, empty chambers, as if the earth has taken a breath and held it. Lena spent more and more time in her lab, peering into her microscopes at the extremophiles she had collected. But her focus had shifted. She was no longer cataloging life. She was watching it die. Her slides showed the organisms becoming sluggish, their vibrant, alien bioluminescence fading to a dull, sickly gray. "They're not just dying," she told me, her voice a hollow echo. "They're forgetting how to live." The presence, for I can call it nothing else, began to manifest in more tangible ways. I would wake in the deep of the night, the chronometer showing 3:17 a.m., always 3:17, with the certain knowledge that I was not alone in my pod. There was no figure, no shadow. It was a pressure change, a displacement of air, the feeling you get when someone is standing very close behind you, their body heat altering the space between you. Juno would be awake too, standing on my bed, her ears flat, her body trembling, a thin whine escaping her throat. She was not looking at the door. She was staring at a bare, empty corner of the room, her head tilted as if trying to solve a difficult puzzle. One night, the fear became too much. I left my pod and walked the short, cold corridor to the common area for a glass of water. The motion sensor lights flickered on, casting long, hurried shadows. As I passed the main airlock door, I stopped. Etched into the thick frost coating the inside of the porthole was a handprint. It was large, far larger than any of ours, with long, distended fingers. The frost around it was melted away, as if the print had been made by a hand of immense heat. But the metal of the door itself, just on the other side of that glass, was frozen solid, colder than death. I stood there, my own breath pluming in the frigid air, staring at that impossible, burning cold print. I did not wake the others. What would I say? That the cold itself had touched our door. The unraveling accelerated. Flynn, convinced we were being stalked by a rogue polar bear or some Russian spy, took to spending nights in the watchtower, a small exposed platform atop the main pod. He came down one morning, his face a mask of frostbite and terror. His eyes were wide, unfocused. "It walks," he slurred, his teeth chattering. "It doesn't crunch the snow. It settles like dust." Thorne sedated him, but the damage was done. The seed of a shared, specific fear was now planted in all of us. 2 nights later, the power failed. The hum of the generators ceased, and the lights died, plunging Terminus into a blackness so absolute it felt like being swallowed. The emergency batteries kicked in after a heart-stopping few seconds, powering only the essential systems and a few dim red emergency lights. In the bloody gloom, we huddled together. The wind outside sounded different without the generator's hum to compete with. It was louder, more articulate, and underneath it, the graveled breath was no longer subtle. It was a clear, resonant sound, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Flynn, his sanity a thin, shattered pain, grabbed his rifle and screamed into the darkness. A long, incoherent stream of curses and challenges. He unlocked the main airlock before any of us could stop him. "I see you!" he shrieked, and he fired a single deafening shot into the night. The report was swallowed by the wind almost instantly. He stood there, framed in the doorway, the blizzard howling around him. And then he was gone. Not pulled, not dragged. He simply took a step forward and was erased from existence. One moment he was a silhouette against the swirling snow. The next, there was only the black. We managed to seal the door, our hands numb and clumsy with fear. We never found a body. Not a boot, not a scrap of his parka. It was as if the darkness had simply inhaled him. That was the revelation. The thing that stalked us was not an animal. It was not a ghost. It was the landscape. It was the darkness and the cold and the ancient, patient ice given a form of consciousness. We were not being hunted. We were being absorbed. Our fear, our sanity, our very warmth were just fleeting anomalies in its eternal frozen equilibrium. We were a brief fever dream in the mind of a glacier, and the dream was ending. Thorne, the man of logic, broke. He sat in a corner, rocking back and forth, muttering about tectonic plates and the weight of continents. Lena and I were alone, the last 2 sparks of warmth in a cosmos of cold. She found me in my pod, clutching Juno, who was whining softly, constantly. Lena's face was calm, resigned. "It doesn't hate us, Dominic," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That would require too much feeling. It is simply aware of us, like we are aware of a bacterium on our skin. And now it's scratching." She was right. The presence was in the pod with us. I could feel it. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying that smell of wet stone and immense age. The red emergency light seemed to dim, the darkness pressing in, becoming a substance, a liquid obsidian that filled the room. It had no eyes, no face, no form I could describe. It was a folding of space, a concentration of the absolute zero that lived outside our walls. It was the essence of the void, and it was curious. Juno let out a final, terrified yelp and fell silent, pressing herself against me, a small, warm shudder in the growing cold. Lena looked at it, at the nothingness that was more solid than any something. and she smiled a sad, gentle smile. She took a step towards it, her hand outstretched. "It's so lonely," she breathed. And then she was gone. Not vanished, but undone. Her form seemed to dissolve, not into mist, but into a sudden, perfect stillness. The particles of her being were scattered into the waiting, infinite patience of the cold. There was no sound, only a final, soft exhalation that was not her own, but the thing's, a sigh of satisfaction. Now it is just me, and Juno, Dada, and the thing that shares this pod. The emergency lights have failed completely. The cold is inside now, not a temperature, but a state of being. I can feel it in my lungs, my blood, my thoughts. My fingers are numb, and this journal, this damned journal with its damp skin paper, is the last anchor I have to what I was. Juno no longer whines. She is curled against my leg, a small, cold weight. I can feel the presence settling around us, not with malice, but with a terrible, slow inevitability, like the layers of sediment that buried Thorn's fossils. It is not killing us. It is accepting us back. It is the final, quiet integration of a temporary disturbance into the eternal, silent whole. I can no longer feel my hands. The pen is a distant, heavy thing. The dark is not empty anymore. It is full. It is a presence, a consciousness, a being of perfect, silent, cold peace. And in the absolute black, under the weight of 1 billion tons of ice, in the heart of the endless night, there is only one sound that remains. It is the sound of my own heartbeat, slowing, each thump a vast and lonely echo in the stillness, a fading drum counting down the last moments of warmth, a rhythm being gently, patiently absorbed into the great, slow, breathing dark. The pen slipped from my fingers. I did not hear it land. The silence had become a physical thing, a wool packed into my ears, a density that absorbed all vibration. Juno was a statue of cold fur against my leg. I tried to move my hand to touch her one last time, to feel the familiar texture of her coat, but the command dissolved somewhere between my mind and my arm. The connection was severed. My body was no longer my own. It was a landscape of ice, a territory being reclaimed. The presence did not move closer. It had no need. It was simply expanding, like ink in water, filling the space that we had foolishly claimed as our own. The concept of a pod, of walls, of a separate inside, was a childish fantasy. There was only this, the unity of the cold. My thoughts began to unravel, not into madness, but into a strange, placid clarity. I saw the entire history of this place, not as a timeline, but as a single frozen image. The slow grind of glaciers, the migration of long-extinct beasts, whose bones were now dust beneath the ice. The brief, bright flare of our expedition. A match struck in a cathedral. It was all the same. All part of the same immense, patient process. Lena was not gone. She was distributed. Flynn was not lost. He was returned. Thorn's data was not anomalous. It was a glimpse of the truth, the hollow spaces where the world took a breath and held it for 1,000,000 years. A final sluggish thump echoed in my chest. It was not a sound, but a tremor that traveled through the ice, through the rock, a tiny, insignificant seismic event. The space between the beats stretched into an eternity. I was no longer Dominic Reed, the documentarian. I was a memory that the darkness was remembering. I was a note in a song so long and slow that no living thing would ever hear its melody. The last thing I was aware of was not sight or sound, but a sensation of settling, like a feather landing on a vast, still lake. There was no impact, only a perfect, seamless integration. The final fragile ember of my consciousness flickered, not in resistance, but in recognition. It was a homecoming to a home I had never known I'd left. And then, there was no I. There was only the cold, and the dark, and the peace. The story of Terminus was over. Its final entry was written not in ink, but in the slow, inevitable crystallization of a man's blood. The silence that followed was not an absence, but a completion. The outpost, with its dead lights and frozen machinery, became just another rock formation, a slight temporary irregularity on the face of the eternal ice. Centuries passed. The ice shifted, as it always does, in its slow, dreaming dance. A pod wall, stressed by the unimaginable weight, buckled inward with a soundless, groaning tear. The outside and the inside were finally, formally introduced. There was no rush of wind, for the air within had long since achieved perfect equilibrium with the air without. The cold within was the same as the cold without. The process was finished. More time, vast and unmeasured, flowed over the place. The continent's ice sheet, responding to pressures deep within the planet, began a new imperceptible migration. It scraped over the ruins of Terminus, grinding the metal pods and the bones within into a fine, metallic and calcium grit. It was a gentle process, a kind of annealing. The debris was folded back into the glacier, a new vein in the ancient blue ice. 1,000 years after the last human heartbeat had faded, the glacier reached the sea. Its leading edge, a cliff of ice 100 meters high, calved into the water with a roar that was, for a moment, the loudest sound on Earth. But the silence that followed was deeper and older. An iceberg, the size of a mountain, began its slow, stately drift into the Southern Ocean. Trapped within its heart, a single, dark speck of impurity traveled with it. It was all that remained of a journal. Its pages, and the confession they held long since dissolved, its leather binding, and the metal clip of its pen now just another mineral composite, indistinguishable from the surrounding debris. It was a part of the iceberg, as the iceberg was a part of the sea. The iceberg drifted north into warmer waters. The sun, which had abandoned Terminus, now assailed its remnant. The ice melted, releasing its captured air, its ancient water, and its microscopic cargo of minerals and memories into the churning, living ocean. The particles that had once been a man, a dog, a settlement, were scattered into the vast circulating currents. They became part of the plankton, then the krill, then the whale that fed on them. The thing that had been at Terminus did not die, for it had never been alive in any way that could be measured by biology. It was a condition, a state of being. And as the ice melted, and the water evaporated, and fell as rain on continents far away, that condition spread. It was in the deep, cold currents that slid beneath the tropical seas. It was in the quiet patience of a stone at the bottom of a river. It was in the vast, silent spaces between the stars that the night sky revealed. It was not malevolent. It was not kind. It was simply there. A truth written in cold and dark, waiting, as it always had, for the temporary fires of life to sputter and go out, and for the universe in its own time to finally and completely settle. The whale, heavy with a century of songs and the cold, deep knowledge it had ingested, swam its ancient migratory routes. It felt no different. The presence within it was not a parasite, but a passenger, a stillness in its warm, beating heart. When the whale finally died, its great body sinking into the abyssal plains, the presence settled into the sediment with the bones. It was a return to a deeper, older darkness than the ice had offered, a silence punctuated only by the occasional flicker of a chemosynthetic creature in the void. On the surface, the world continued its frantic, burning dance. Cities grew and shone like fever dreams against the night. In a library in one such city, a man sat at a desk, struggling to write. He was a novelist, plagued by a block that had lasted for years. He stared at the blank screen, the glow of it harsh in the dim room. He felt a profound, aching emptiness, a creative void that he could not cross. He decided to take a walk to clear his head. The night air was warm, thick with the smells of exhaust and blooming jasmine. But as he turned a corner onto a quieter street, a sudden, inexplicable chill passed through him. It was not the chill of wind, but of place, of profound isolation. He stopped, looking up at the narrow strip of sky between the buildings. The stars were obscured by light pollution, but the darkness felt different. It felt attentive. A line came to him then, fully formed, as if whispered from the very air. He did not understand it, but he felt a compulsion to write it down. He hurried back to his desk, the strange cold still lingering in his bones. His fingers flew across the keyboard, no longer hesitant. The story he wrote was not his own. It was a story of ice and silence, of a darkness that was not empty, but full. He wrote of a place called Terminus, and a man named Dominic, and a dog named Juno. He wrote until his hands were stiff, and the sun was rising, and when he was done, he looked at the words with a feeling of deep, unshakable dread. He had given form to something that should have remained formless. He published the book. It was called The Quiet. It was hailed as a work of unsettling genius, a masterpiece of atmospheric horror. Readers wrote to him saying they felt a profound coldness while reading it, that they had to put it down and check the locks on their doors. They spoke of a lingering sense of being watched, of a sadness so vast it felt geological. The presence, disseminated through 1,000,000 printed pages and 1,000,000,000 digital bits, found new soil. It was no longer confined to the cold places. It now thrived in the quiet moments between thoughts, in the loneliness of a crowded room, in the hollow feeling that follows the end of things. It did not need to hunt. It simply waited. It was the silence after the music ends, the cold at the edge of the firelight, the patient, endless dark that knows, with absolute certainty, that all fires eventually go out. And in the heart of a reader, alone in their room late at night, finishing the final page and feeling the world grow just a little quieter, a little colder, it was home. He never wrote another book. He couldn't. The words for The Quiet had not been a gift, but a transaction, and the price had been his own voice. He spent his days in a state of quietude, staring out windows, feeling the slow, patient chill that had taken root in his core. He preferred the cold seasons and the long, dark nights. He was, his few remaining friends thought, a man waiting for something. Across the world, in a small, cluttered apartment, a young woman named Elara closed the cover of The Quiet. The central heating hummed, but she shivered, pulling a blanket tight around her shoulders. The story had gotten inside her in a way no other book ever had. It felt less like fiction and more like a memory she had forgotten, a dream she'd once had. The silence of her apartment, usually a comfort, now felt charged. It felt deep. She stood and walked to her window, looking down at the city lights 8 floors below. The world was alive, buzzing with energy, but the feeling persisted. It was the sensation of being a temporary spark in an immeasurable darkness. It was not a frightening thought, not exactly. It was a heavy one, a solemn weight of truth. She found her eyes drifting away from the bright lights, towards the patches of profound black between the buildings, the alleyways, the empty lots, the spaces where the city's glow could not reach. They seemed more real to her now, more substantive than the frantic light. She tried to shake it off. She made tea, turned on the television, sought out the noise and the clutter of human life. But the feeling was a stain on her perception. Days later, she was in a museum, standing before a display of ancient mammoth tusks recovered from the permafrost. She pressed her hand against the cool glass of the case. and a jolt, like a static shock but cold, shot up her arm. She saw, for a fleeting second, not the museum hall, but a vast white plain under a black sky. The vision was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only a residue of immense loneliness. She pulled her hand back, her heart hammering. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the vision was from the book. It was the place, Terminus. The presence, having found a particularly receptive vessel, began its gentle work. It did not speak. It did not need to. It simply was, and its being encouraged a certain kind of seeing. Elara started noticing the cold spaces in the world. The draft from a poorly sealed window was not just a draft. It was a breath. The quiet of a library was not an absence, but a presence. She began to seek out these places, drawn by a melancholy she could not name. She would walk for hours in the dead of night, through sleeping neighborhoods and deserted parks, feeling the stillness settle around her like a cloak. She was no longer afraid of the dark. She was beginning to understand it. She tried to find the author, to write him a letter, to ask him where the story had truly come from. She discovered he had died years before, a quiet, reclusive death. The obituary was short. It said he had written one great chilling novel, and then had written nothing more. It said he had seemed in his final years to be a man profoundly at peace with something the rest of the world could not see. Reading those words, Elara felt a pang of recognition. It was not the peace of contentment. It was the peace of surrender. It was the peace of a problem finally solved. A question finally answered. It was the peace of the quiet, the cold, the dark. She stood up from her computer and walked back to the window. The city was the same, but she was not. The frantic energy below seemed futile now, a desperate and beautiful attempt to hold back the inevitable night. She felt a calmness she had never known. She did not turn on any lights. She let the darkness of her apartment fill up around her, solid and real. She was not lonely. She was, for the first time, not alone. The presence was with her, not as a ghost, but as a fact. It was the fact of the ice at the poles, the fact of the deep ocean trenches, the fact of the vacuum between galaxies. It was the universe, reminding a small, warm part of itself what it truly was. And in the quiet of her room, Elara closed her eyes, and she began to listen to the sound of her own heartbeat, slowing, and she smiled. The smile was not one of happiness, but of alignment. It was the grim, accepting curve of a key finding its lock. The frantic pulse of the city outside became a distant, irrelevant hum, a flickering against a canvas of permanent night. Her own breathing deepened, slowed, until each inhalation felt like drawing in a piece of that eternal stillness. The warmth of her body, that small, defiant fire she had carried all her life, began to bank. It was not a sickness, not a weakness. It was a homecoming. She did not move for a long time. The darkness in the room ceased to be a mere absence of light and became a substance, a velvet weight that pressed in on her with a gentle, inexorable pressure. It was the same pressure that held the continents in place, that guided the planets in their orbits. It was the universe holding her. The last vestiges of Elara, the person with a name and a history and anxieties about rent and career, began to dissolve like sugar in water. They were stories she had told herself, temporary arrangements of energy and matter that were now being gently corrected. She saw, without her eyes, the long, slow journey of the particles that had once been Dominic Reed. She felt the glacial patience that had absorbed him, the deep, cold currents that had carried his essence, and the final, quiet integration into the whale, and then the abyssal ooze. It was not a tragedy. It was a process of refinement, a return to a more stable, more enduring state. Her own dissolution was simply the next step in the same, endless cycle. The author had been a conduit. She was becoming a destination. When the sun rose, its light did not penetrate the room. It seemed to stop at the window, defeated by the profound quiet that had solidified within. Elara, or what had been Alara, was now a focal point. The presence was not in her, it was her. The apartment was not a shelter from the world, but a beachhead. The cold was not seeping in from outside. It was radiating out from within her. A gentle, spreading stain of absolute zero. Downstairs, a neighbor's dog, a small terrier that usually yapped at everything, fell silent. It whined once, low in its throat, and then curled into a tight ball, pressing itself against the door, seeking a warmth that was rapidly leaching from the world. In the street, a man on his way to work suddenly stopped, his phone forgotten in his hand. A feeling of profound, unshakable calm washed over him. A sense that all his worries were insignificant, fleeting motes in an infinite, quiet ocean. He stood there for 10 minutes, just breathing, feeling a peace he had never known, a peace that felt strangely like an ending. The process was slow. It was patient. It had all the time in the world. It would not consume the city in a flash of ice and terror. It would simply calm it. It would settle over the noise and the haste like a blanket, soothing the frantic chaos into a deep and lasting silence. The fires of life would gutter out, not with a scream, but with a sigh. And in the end, there would be no one left to write about it, no one left to read it. There would only be the quiet, the cold, the dark, and the perfect, peaceful knowledge that everything was, finally, as it was always meant to be. The change in the man on the street was permanent. He never went to his office again. He left his phone on the pavement and walked away from his life, drawn by an inexplicable pull toward the river. He sat on a cold bench and watched the water flow, and the frantic thoughts that had plagued him for decades simply stilled. He felt no urge to move, no hunger, no fear. He was, for the first time, completely content. By nightfall, he was just another still figure in the gathering dark, a man who had found a profound and terminal form of peace. In Elara's apartment, the transformation was complete. The body that sat in the chair by the window was no longer a living thing in any biological sense. It was a sculpture of flesh, a monument to the process that had transpired. The cold that emanated from it was not the absence of heat, but the presence of something else, something ancient and absolute. It seeped through the floorboards, a slow, viscous tide of stillness. The neighbor's dog stopped whining. It lay still, its small chest barely moving. Its eyes were open, but they no longer saw the door. They saw the vast white plain and the endless, starless sky. Its consciousness, a simple, warm thing, was being unwound, its brief, fiery story being gently edited back into the silent text of the universe. The presence did not spread like a plague. It propagated through understanding. It was a truth that, once truly felt, could not be unfelt. A woman watering her plants on the next block felt a sudden, chilling clarity as she snapped a dead leaf from a stem. The cycle of growth and decay was not a tragedy, but a quiet, mechanical process. The green life was the anomaly. The brown stillness was the rule. She lowered her watering can and sat on her balcony until the sun went down, perfectly calm, perfectly still. It was a conversion of a different kind. There were no rallies, no sermons, just a dawning, quiet acceptance in the hearts of those who were ready to hear the old, slow song beneath the noise of the world. One by one, the frantic sparks of the city began to wink out. The silence was not a roar. It was a subtle, accumulating weight, like snow piling on a branch. The lights in the windows did not shatter. They were simply not turned on again. The cars did not crash. They rolled to a stop as their drivers found a reason to cease their journeys. The world was not ending in fire or ice. It was being reconciled. It was returning to a state of rest. The presence, now fully awake and rooted in 1,000 points across the city, was not a conqueror. It was a librarian, patiently reshelving the loud, chaotic, temporary books of life, and returning the library to its natural state of perfect, eternal order. And in the deep, quiet heart of it all, where Ilara had been, there was only the patient, endless, and loving dark. Days turned into weeks, and the city's noise was replaced by a profound and unbroken quiet. The wind rustled leaves in the parks, but there was no one left to hear it. Rain fell on empty streets, cleaning the grime from silent cars and storefronts. The power grid, starved of human maintenance, flickered and died. The nights became truly dark, the sky now visible in a way it hadn't been for centuries, a vast black canopy dotted with indifferent stars. The quiet spread not as a wave, but as a season. It traveled down coastlines on cold, dense fog. It moved inland along riverbeds, settling in valleys and hollows. It was carried on the jet stream, a particulate of perfect stillness falling with the rain. In a busy foreign capital, a diplomat, overwhelmed by the screaming headlines and the impossible demands of his job, felt a sudden, chilling clarity during a heated debate. He stopped speaking mid-sentence, looked out the window at the gray sky, and simply walked away from the table. The argument, like all arguments, was suddenly meaningless. It was not death, not in the way life had defined it. It was a cessation of struggle. The animals were affected too. The migratory birds, guided by an ancient, frantic need to breed and feed, one by one abandoned their roots. They would alight on a branch or a cliff ledge and simply stay, their small, hot hearts slowing until they were as still as the rocks they perched upon. The forests grew quiet. The oceans grew calm. The great, hot, churning engine of the biosphere was powering down. A year passed, then another. The green world, untended, began to reclaim the cities. Vines cracked the asphalt, and ivy scaled the silent towers. But this was not a vibrant, new explosion of life. It was a slow green shroud. The plants themselves grew slower, their photosynthesis a languid, half-hearted process. The very chemistry of the air began to change, the oxygen content slowly falling as the great consumer of it. The frantic fire of animal life was extinguished. The presence had no center, no mind to think or plan. It was a universal constant reasserting itself. It was the equilibrium the universe had always been seeking. On the surface of the planet, the only movement was the geological, the slow drift of continents, the patient carving of canyons by water and wind. The temporary, brilliant fever of life had passed. The memory of it was not lost, but it was filed away, like a dream upon waking, vivid for a moment, then fading into the undisturbed fabric of the real. And high above, in the void between worlds, a Voyager probe, a tiny silent artifact of the lost civilization, continued its endless journey. It carried a golden record, a testament to the noise and the warmth and the hope of its builders. But the record was now a message with no one to receive it, a story with no reader. It sailed on through the perfect, airless, soundless dark, a final, fitting tribute to the quiet it had left behind, heading home to the vast, patient silence from which it had never truly escaped. Story 2. The light in the hallway did not so much flicker as it breathed. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm, a soft amber pulse that swelled and receded from the sconce on the wallpapered wall, casting the faded pattern of peonies and vines into a momentary, writhing relief before letting it sink back into the gloom. Bruce stood at the foot of the stairs, a bag of groceries gone heavy in his arms, and watched it. He had lived in this old Victorian on the edge of the silent, pine-choked town of Hemlock for 3 years, and the house had always had its quirks, its sighs and its aches. But this was new. This was intentional. The light was breathing, and he was the only one there to hear it. He did not run. Running was for things you understood, for threats with shape and name. This was a different kind of unease, a seepage into the edges of reality. He set the groceries on the bottom step and followed the pulsing glow down the hall, past the closed doors of unused rooms, toward the kitchen at the back of the house. The floorboards, usually a chorus of creaks, were mute under his feet, as if the house itself was holding its breath with him. The kitchen door was ajar, and from within came not the hum of the refrigerator but a different sound, a low, soft thrumming that vibrated in the fillings of his teeth. Pushing the door open, he saw the source. The old radio on the counter, unplugged for a decade, was glowing with the same soft, internal light. And there, curled on the worn linoleum before it, was a creature. It was small, no larger than a barn cat, and its form seemed woven from living shadow and starlight. Its skin, or pelt, or whatever it was, shifted in the radio's glow, a deep indigo dappled with patterns of silver that swirled and coalesced like a galaxy in miniature. It had large, liquid eyes, the color of ancient amber, and they were fixed on him, not with fear, but with a profound, weary intelligence. One of its forelimbs was bent at an unnatural angle, and a dark, sap-like substance seeped from a gash on its flank. The thrumming was coming from it, a low, pained, melodic sound that resonated in the hollow of Bruce's chest. He knelt, his own breath catching. The creature did not flinch. It merely watched him, its head tilted, and the thrumming softened into a questioning tone. He saw then that it was not an animal, not as he knew them. Its grace was otherworldly, its silence a language. He reached out a hand, slowly, and the creature nudged its head against his fingers. The contact was electric, a cool, calming current that flowed up his arm and settled the frantic beating of his heart. In that touch, he felt not words, but concepts. Sanctuary, pain, pursuit. He named it Lumen. Weeks bled into months. Bruce's lonely existence, once defined by the hollow echo of his footsteps in the large house, was filled with a quiet, profound purpose. Lumen's leg healed, though Bruce never said it, the bone seeming to knit itself under the shifting skin. The creature required no food, only seeming to draw sustenance from the sun during the day, its dappled patterns brightening, and from the quiet and the strange ambient energies of the house at night. But it communicated in a tapestry of emotion and image, projecting feelings of contentment that felt like warm sunlight on closed eyelids, or flickers of memory that were not his own. Sterile white corridors, the scent of ozone and fear, the cold touch of steel. It showed him the other one, a creature of the same origin, a sibling of sorts, but born of a different intent. Where Lumen was crafted for cognition and connection, the other was forged for fury. In Lumen's projected memories, Bruce saw it, a hulking, asymmetrical thing of jagged bone and obsidian flesh, its form a brutal rejection of symmetry. It had no eyes, only a smooth, pitted plate of bone where a face should be, and a mouth that was a ragged tear filled with needles of crystalline teeth. It was called the Shrike, and it was a predator, a perfect, relentless engine of dissolution. It did not eat, it unmade. It had been built to hunt, to track, to terminate, and it had escaped with Lumen, its programming twisted into a singular hateful purpose, to find and destroy the one thing its creators deemed perfect. Lumen was the prize. The Shrike was the punishment. Bruce's world, which had shrunk to the confines of his house and the silent understanding with his strange companion, was forced open by Cecilia. She was the new librarian, a woman with quiet eyes and a laugh that seemed to startle even herself with its rarity. She had come to his door asking about the history of the house, her curiosity a gentle, persistent force. He found himself letting her in, first to the foyer, then to the parlor, and finally, with a trepidation that made his hands shake, to the sunroom where Lumen now spent its afternoons. Cecilia did not scream. She did not gasp. She simply stood, her hand going to her throat, and watched as Lumen uncurled from its patch of sunlight and approached her. It thrummed softly, its amber eyes regarding her. Then it did something it had never done with Bruce. It reached out a delicate three-fingered hand and touched her cheek. Cecilia's eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of a staggering, inexplicable recognition. "Oh," she whispered, "you're so far from home." She became his ally, his confessor, the only other soul who knew the truth. Their bond, forged in this shared impossible secret, deepened into something tender and fierce. They built a life in the shadow of the extraordinary, a fragile peace guarded by the old house and the whispering pines. But the outside world had not forgotten. A man in a beige sedan began to appear, parked at the end of the long gravel drive. He never approached, just watched. He was from the Agaganus Corporation. Lumen showed them in a flash of shared memory. The creators, the cleaners, the omens accumulated. The breathing light returned, but now it was a frantic, a rhythmic stutter. The radio in the kitchen crackled to life one night, spitting a stream of static that resolved, for a single chilling second, into a sound like shattering glass and a child's scream. The house's sighs became moans. The scent of ozone, the same from Lumen's memories, began to linger in the basement, and then the animals went silent. The crickets, the owls, the rustling things in the undergrowth, all fell into a watchful, terrified hush. The revelation came on a night choked with a thick, unnatural fog that smothered the moon. The power died. Not a flicker, but a total, absolute extinction. The house plunged into a blackness so complete it felt solid. Bruce and Cecilia huddled in the living room. Lumen pressed between them, its body trembling, its thrumming a high, tight wire of alarm. Then came the sound. It started as a dry rustle, like a bundle of sticks being dragged across the porch roof. Then it became a scrape, a slow, grating sound of something hard scoring deep grooves into the wood. It was on the roof. The shrike. Bruce clutched a fireplace poker, his knuckles white. Cecilia held Lumen, her face pale but set. The scraping stopped. A profound silence fell, heavier than the fog. Then a single sharp tap on the window pane. Damp, but like a stone. Bruce turned his head, his neck cracking with the tension. There, pressed against the glass, was not a face, but the smooth, bone-white plate. It filled the pane, and from behind it, a low, resonant frequency began to emanate, a subsonic hum that made the glass vibrate and their stomachs clench with a primal nausea. It was a sound that sought not to be heard, but to be felt in the marrow. A sound that promised only an end to being. The front door splintered inward with a sound like a gunshot. It didn't burst. It seemed to dissolve, the wood around the lock turning black and crumbly, falling apart as if aged 1,000 years in an instant. And it stood in the doorway, the shrike unfolding itself to its full, towering height. It was wrongness given form. A blasphemy of anatomy that hurt the eyes to look upon. The air around it grew cold and carried the smell of static and spoiled meat. Lumen pushed away from Cecilia and stood in the center of the room. Its own light flared, a brilliant, defiant silver that pushed back the oppressive gloom. It did not thrum. It sang. A single clear crystalline note that hung in the air. A shard of pure beauty in the face of absolute ugliness. The shrike hesitated, its head cocking. For a moment, the terrible hum ceased. Then it lunged. The climax was not a fight. It was an annihilation. Bruce swung the poker, but the shrike moved with an insectile speed. its taloned limb deflecting the blow and sending a jolt of paralyzing cold up Bruce's arm. Cecilia threw a heavy book, which the creature ignored as it would a fly. Its focus was entirely on Lumen. It was a dance of creation and destruction, the silver light of Lumen flowing and weaving, the black form of the Shrike striking and corroding. Where its claws passed, the rug withered, the wallpaper peeled and blackened. Lumen was not trying to win. It was trying to communicate, to reach the spark of its sibling buried under the layers of programmed rage. It projected waves of memory. The sterile lab, the two of them in separate glass cells, a shared moment of silent understanding. The Shrike recoiled as if burned, its hum becoming a shriek of feedback that shattered the remaining window panes. The memory was a poison to its purpose. With a final, desperate surge of energy, Lumen projected one last, powerful image. Not of the lab, but of Bruce and Cecilia. Of the sunroom, of the simple, profound peace of a shared life. A feeling of home. The Shrike froze. Its jagged form seemed to tremble. The smooth bone of its faceplate tilted. For a single, heart-stopping second, Bruce thought it had worked. Then the man from the beige sedan stepped through the ruined doorway, a sleek black device in his hand. He was calm, professional. "Stand down, Subject A," he said, his voice flat. He aimed the device at Lumen. "The asset is coming home." The Shrike's hesitation shattered. The intrusion of its master, the reminder of its chains, broke whatever fragile thread had been forming. It moved, not toward Lumen, but toward the man. It was a blur of rage and finality. There was no blood, no scream. The man and the device in his hand simply crumbled, collapsing into a pile of gray dust and twisted metal. In the moment of the Shrike's distraction, Lumen looked at Bruce and Cecilia. Its song changed, becoming a chord of profound sorrow and unwavering love. Then it turned and threw itself at the Shrike. The two forms met in a silent, terrible conflagration. The silver light did not explode. It imploded, drawing in on itself and pulling the black form of the Shrike with it. There was a sound like a universe sighing, a flash of light that left no afterimage, and then nothing. The living room was empty, save for the ruined door, the shattered windows, and a fine silvery dust that settled slowly in the still, cold air. The epilogue was a quiet, gray affair. There was no body to bury, no closure to be found in ritual. The authorities came, asked their questions, and left, chalking it up to a bizarre home invasion and a missing persons case for the man from Agonis. The corporation, it seemed, had already swept its failure under the rug. The world moved on. Bruce and Cecilia moved through the days that followed like ghosts in their own home. They repaired the door, replaced the windows, but they could not repair the silence. It was a presence in itself, a lumen-shaped void that echoed through every room. One morning, a month after the end, Bruce walked out the back door and into the pine forest that bordered their property. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and resin. He did not look back at the house where he had found a companion and lost it, where he had found love in the shadow of the impossible. He simply walked, his footsteps quiet on the bed of fallen needles. He walked past the place where the animals had once fallen silent, past the familiar landmarks of his old, lonely life. He walked until the house was far behind him, until the only sound was the whisper of the wind in the high branches and the distant, lonely cry of a bird. He did not know where he was going, only that he was leaving. The memory of Lumen was a quiet, silver light inside him, a glow in the shadow of all that had been, and all that was yet to be. He walked on, never looking back, into the waiting, indifferent trees. The forest was a cathedral of quiet. Sunlight, thin and pale, filtered through the dense canopy of hemlock and pine, dappling the soft, needle-strewn floor. Bruce walked without a path, guided by an instinct he could not name. It was the same instinct that had kept him in the house for 3 years, that had allowed him to see the breathing light for what it was. It was a pull, a faint, silvery thread tied to a part of his soul he had not known existed before Lumen. He walked for hours, his mind a blank slate of grief and motion. The images of that final night played on a loop, but they were distant now, like a story about someone else. The feel of Cecilia's hand in his as they stood in the ruined living room was the last solid anchor to the world he was leaving behind. She had understood. Her eyes, full of a sorrow that mirrored his own, had told him that she knew he had to go. The house was a tomb, a monument. He needed to find a place where the memory could breathe. As dusk began to bleed the color from the world, he came to a clearing. In its center stood a single ancient oak, its branches gnarled and widespread, a testament to centuries of solitude. At its base, nestled among the thick, exposed roots, was a pool of water so clear and still it seemed to be a piece of the sky that had fallen to earth. Bruce knelt, his body aching with a weariness that went beyond the physical. He cupped his hands and drank. The water was cold and tasted of stone and secrets. He sat with his back against the oak, the rough bark solid and real through his jacket. The last of the daylight faded, and the stars emerged, sharp and cold in the moonless sky. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since the end, he did not try to push the memory away. He let Lumen in, the cool touch of its head against his fingers, the thrumming that was not a sound but a feeling, the images of a home that was not a place but a connection. He felt the echo of that final, sorrowful chord, and for the first time, he did not feel only the loss. He felt the love woven into it. It was a love that had unmade a monster and saved them. A soft light began to glow in the clearing. Bruce opened his eyes, thinking it was a trick of his grief-stricken mind. But it persisted. It was not the amber pulse of the hallway, nor the brilliant silver of Lumen's final stand. It was a gentle, greenish-blue luminescence that rose from the mosses at the base of the trees and from the very surface of the pool. It pulsed slowly, rhythmically, a heartbeat of the earth itself. And as he watched, he saw them. Faint, shimmering motes of light, like embers from a dying fire, drifting down from the branches of the ancient oak. They swirled in the air, and for a moment, they coalesced into a familiar, dappled pattern before dissolving again into the night. It was not Lumen. It was something else, something older and vaster, but it was a part of the same tapestry. Lumen had been a note in a cosmic song, and this forest, this earth, was the chorus. The Shrike and its creators had believed they were the only players in a game of their own design. They were wrong. The universe was wider, stranger, and more full of grace than they could possibly comprehend. Bruce did not move. He sat through the night, watching the gentle light show, feeling a peace settle over him that was deeper than any he had known. He was not alone. He had never been alone. The memory was not a ghost to be mourned, but a seed that had been planted. When the first rays of dawn touched the highest branches of the oak, the luminescence faded, leaving the clearing in the soft, gray light of morning. Bruce stood, his joints stiff, his heart strangely light. He knew now that he was not leaving to escape. He was leaving to listen. He turned his face to the east, to the rising sun, and took the first step of the rest of his life, the silvery dust of a fallen star, a permanent guiding light within him. The path he found was not one he made, but one that revealed itself. A deer trail, faint and narrow, wound its way eastward, following the contour of the land as if it knew a secret. Bruce followed it. His hunger was a dull ache, his thirst a manageable thing after the water from the pool. He moved with a purpose that felt both new and ancient, a pilgrim on a road without a name. He walked for 2 days. The forest changed, the pines giving way to older, deciduous trees, their leaves just beginning to turn. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the trail ended at a wire fence, rusted and sagging with the weight of years. Beyond it was a field of wild grasses. And beyond that, a road. Not a highway, but a weathered strip of asphalt that curled away over a hill. He pushed through a gap in the fence and stood for a long time, looking at the road. It was a line between the world he had known and the one he was entering. A truck, an old pickup with a splintered wooden bed, rattled to a stop beside him. The driver, a woman with a face as lined and weathered as the bark of the old oak, leaned across the seat and pushed the passenger door open. "You look lost," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Or found. I can never tell the difference." Bruce got in. The cab smelled of gasoline and dried herbs. They drove in silence for several miles, the forest receding in the side mirror, a green wall becoming a smudge on the horizon. "The old Henderson place back there," the woman said eventually, not taking her eyes off the road. "Heard some strange things about it lately. Lights, sounds." She glanced at him, her eyes sharp and knowing. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Bruce met her gaze. He saw no malice there, only a deep, weary curiosity. "It's quiet now," he said, and it was all the answer he gave. She nodded slowly, as if he had confirmed something she already knew. "My nephew, Eli. He's a radio man. Ham radio. Picks up all sorts of things, mostly junk. But lately, he's been getting a signal. A clean one. No voice. Just a tone. A single clear note. Says it's the most beautiful thing he's ever heard. Drifts in and out, like it's moving." She pointed a gnarled finger ahead. "I'm letting you off at the crossroads. Town's that way." She pointed left. "But the signal Eli's getting, it's strongest if you head the other way." She stopped the truck at a junction where a dirt track met the asphalt. Bruce got out. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she replied. "Just listen." She put the truck in gear and pulled away, leaving him standing in a cloud of dust. He turned right, onto the dirt track. It led up a gentle rise. At the top, he stopped. The land fell away before him, a rolling expanse of hills and valleys under a vast, open sky. And there, on the wind, so faint he thought he might be imagining it, he heard it. A single, pure, crystalline note hanging in the air. It was the same note Lumen had sung in its final moments, a shard of beauty against the dying night. It was not out of memory. It was a beacon. He looked back, once in the direction of the house, of Cecilia, of the life that was. He sent a thought, a feeling of love and gratitude, hoping on some impossible frequency that it would reach her. Then he turned his face forward, toward the sound. He did not know what he would find, a fragment, an echo, or something entirely new. But the silvery dust inside him glowed in response, a quiet resonance with the call in the air. His journey was not over. It was just beginning. He took a deep breath, and he walked on. The note grew no louder as he walked, but it grew clearer, a constant, unwavering tone that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. It guided him not like a shout, but like a plumb line, pulling him toward true north. The dirt track wound through scrubland and past a derelict barn. Its roof caved in like a broken spine. He followed the sound past it, into a stand of willow trees that wept long green tears onto the banks of a slow-moving creek. There, nestled in the mud where the water met the earth, was a shard. It was no larger than his thumb, a piece of smooth, opalescent material that seemed to hold the light of a dead star within its heart. It was from Lumen. He knew it with a certainty that bypassed thought. This was the source of the signal, a final fragmented piece of his friend, still singing its one clear note. He knelt, the damp seeping through the knees of his trousers, and reached for it. His fingers hesitated an inch away. He was not afraid. He was reverent. As his shadow fell over the shard, the note changed. It softened, weaving into a complex chord of welcome and relief. and then it subsided into a gentle, familiar thrum. The same thrum that had once filled the sunroom. The same thrum that had been the soundtrack to his salvation. He picked it up. It was warm, not with the heat of the sun, but with a gentle, internal energy. The moment his skin made contact, a flood of images filled his mind. Not with the force of Lumen's past projections, but with the soft clarity of a shared memory. He saw the implosion from the inside, not as an end, but as a transformation, a scattering, a sowing. Lumen had not been destroyed. It had disseminated, casting its essence to the winds. A silent, secret broadcast for those who knew how to listen. The shard in his hand was a seed, a new purpose, sharp and clear, cut through the fog of his grief. Agonis was still out there. They would have detected the energy surge of the implosion. They would be searching, sweeping the area with their cold clinical instruments, looking for any remnant to capture, to study, to weaponize. They would not understand what they were hearing. They would only see a signal to be triangulated and silenced. He had to find the other pieces. He had to gather the scattered light before the cleaners with their beige sedans and their crumbling devices could snuff it out. He looked at the shard in his palm, its quiet thrum a promise and a plea. The memory of Cecilia was a sharp, sweet pain. He could not go back to her, not yet. To lead Agonis to her doorstep would be the ultimate betrayal. His love for her now had to be a shield, and that meant staying away. He stood, closing his fingers gently around the shard. Its thrumming pulsed against his skin, a tiny, steady heartbeat. He looked up, through the canopy of weeping willows, at the wide, indifferent sky. He was no longer a man haunted by his past. He was a keeper of a future, a guardian of a silent, singing truth. He turned from the creek and began to walk again, the seed of Lumen safe in his hand, its quiet song now a map only he could read. The road ahead was long and fraught with shadows, but for the first time since the end of everything, Bruce was not just walking away. He was walking toward. The first piece had been a gift, a beacon left in a quiet place. The second would not be so easy. The thrum in his palm was a compass, but its pull was subtle. A slight increase in pressure against his skin when he faced a certain direction. A faint brightening of the internal light when he was on the right path. He walked for the rest of the day, following the feeling away from the creek and into a landscape of rolling, rocky hills. The signal led him not to another tranquil clearing, but toward the hum of human activity. By nightfall, he stood on a ridge overlooking a small, sleeping town. A water tower, stark against the twilight sky, was painted with the town's name, Northwood. The pull was strongest toward its center. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The town was a web of eyes and cameras. It was the last place a fragment of something impossible should be. He waited until full dark, then moved down the slope, sticking to the shadows of trees and the backs of buildings. The thrum grew more insistent, a persistent vibration that led him past a shuttered post office and a silent library, finally stopping him before a low, modern building with a sign that read Northwood Community Center. The parking lot was empty. The pull was coming from inside. A side door was unlocked. He slipped in, the thrumming in his hand now a frantic, silent plea. The corridors were dark, lit only by the redded exit signs. He moved past posters for yoga classes and blood drives, following the signal to a closed door marked janitor. He tried the knob. Locked. Got. From the other side of the door, he heard a sound. A soft, rhythmic scraping. Then, a low, pained whimper. It was an animal sound. A creature in distress. Bruce stepped back, his heart hammering. This was wrong. Lumen's fragments were light and song, not this sound of physical pain. He put his ear to the door. The scraping stopped. A new sound began, a wet, ragged breathing. Then, a voice, thin and shredded, whispered through the wood. "It hurts. Please. It hurts so much. Bruce froze. The voice was human, and it was coming from the exact spot where the shard in his hand was pulling him. He looked down. The opalescent fragment was glowing with a sickly, feverish light, its thrum uneven and strained. This was not a seed waiting to be found. It was a wound, festering in the dark. The shrike had been born of pain, and it seemed a piece of lumen, cast adrift, had landed in a place where it could do nothing but absorb the agony around it. He had not come to collect a memory. He had come to perform a mercy. He took a deep breath, braced his shoulder against the door, and pushed. The door gave way with a splintering crack. The room beyond was a small, windowless closet, reeking of bleach and a coppery, metallic scent he recognized as blood. In the far corner, a figure was hunched over, its back to Bruce. It was a man in a janitor's uniform, his shoulders shaking. The rhythmic scraping sound started again. The man was dragging a key back and forth across the concrete floor, his movements jerky and compulsive. On the floor beside him, half hidden in the shadow of a mop bucket, was the source of the light. It was another shard, larger than the one in Bruce's pocket, but its opalescent beauty was marred. A dark, viscous stain, like old oil, crawled across its surface, pulsing in time with the man's ragged breaths. The shard was singing, but its note was distorted, a dissonant wail of captured suffering. "Please," the man whimpered, not turning. "Make it stop. The noise in my head. It never stops." He dragged the key again, the screech setting Bruce's teeth on edge. Bruce understood. The fragment had not caused this man's pain. It had found it, a deep and festering well of human anguish, and had become a resonator for it, amplifying his torment into a feedback loop of misery. The man was trapped, not by the shard. Bruce knelt a few feet away, the clean thrum of his fragment a counterpoint to the corrupted one's wail. He didn't reach for the dark shard. Instead, he focused on the man. He thought of Lumen, not in its final glorious moment, but in its quiet companionship. He thought of the cool, calming presence in his sunroom, the peace it had offered him. He poured that memory, that feeling toward the corrupted shard, a wave of pure, unadulterated empathy. The dark shard flickered. The dissonant note wavered, a crack appearing in its wall of sound. For a second, a clear silver tone broke through. The janitor gasped. His hand stilled, the key falling from his fingers with a clatter. He slowly turned his head. His face was gaunt, etched with lines of profound exhaustion, but his eyes, which Bruce expected to be wild, were just deeply, terribly sad. "It's quieter," he whispered. "It can be," Bruce said. He reached out, not for the man, but for the shard. His fingers closed around the cold, stained surface. The moment he touched it, a jolt of pure despair shot up his arm. A torrent of images. Loss, regret, a lifetime of small, quiet failures. He gritted his teeth, holding on, and pushed back with the memory of Lumen's love, of Cecilia's hand in his, of the quiet light in the forest clearing. The dark stain on the shard recoiled. It writhed like a living thing, then began to dissolve, fading from the surface like ink in water. As it cleared, the shard's true light emerged, soft and silver. Its distorted wail softened, resolved, and then joined in harmony with the note from the shard in Bruce's other hand. A single beautiful chord filled the small room, a sound of release and healing. The janitor let out a long, shuddering sigh. He slumped against the wall, tears cutting clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He was crying, but the sound was no longer one of agony. It was the sound of relief. Bruce stood, the two shards now humming in unison, their light clean and bright. He looked at the man. The noise is gone. The janitor looked up, his eyes clear for the first time. "Thank you," he breathed. Bruce simply nodded. He slipped a new, cleansed shard into his pocket with the first. The combined thrum was stronger now, a chorus where there had been a solo. He had thought he was on a simple mission of collection. He saw now he was wrong. He was a gardener tending to scattered seeds, and some of them had fallen on poisoned ground. He left the janitor to his peace and stepped back out into the night. The hunt was no longer just about finding the pieces. It was about healing them, and he knew, with a cold certainty, that the next fragment would not be waiting in a quiet creek or a dark closet. The strongest signal was pulling him toward the city, where the pain of millions waited. The city was a scar of light on the horizon, a false dawn that never faded. Bruce stood on the shoulder of the interstate, the rumble of trucks a physical force against his chest. The shards in his pocket were no longer a gentle guide. Their hum had become a persistent, urgent vibration, a magnetic pull toward the urban heart. They were not calling to him. They were calling to each other, and the city was where the greatest concentration of their kind had fallen. He hitched a ride with a long-haul trucker who spoke of nothing but diesel prices and bad coffee. And Bruce was grateful for the silence. He watched the landscape flatten and harden, the wild spaces surrendering to concrete and steel. The truck dropped him at a sprawling freight yard on the city's outskirts. The air here was thick with the smells of exhaust and rust, a far cry from the clean scent of pine and earth. The shards pulled him inward, a current he could not fight. He walked for miles through canyons of brick and glass, his senses assaulted by the noise, the movement, the sheer density of life. He felt the collective weight of it all, the stress, the joy, the desperation, the love. A chaotic symphony that was both terrifying and beautiful. And woven through it, like a single silver thread, was the call of the fragments. It led him away from the gleaming towers and into a neighborhood of aging row houses and corner markets. The pull became so strong, it was difficult to walk in a straight line. It was coming from a narrow alley between a laundromat and a boarded-up shop. The air in the alley was cold, a pocket of unnatural chill that raised goosebumps on his arms. At the far end, tucked behind an overflowing dumpster, was a sight that made his blood run cold. A man in a cheap beige trench coat was on his knees. He held a device in his hand, a black box with a flickering green screen and a stubby antenna, and a godliness cleaner. He was scraping at a patch of wall with a metal tool, and embedded in the crumbling brick was a shard of lumen, glowing with a frantic, terrified light. It was smaller than the others, and its song was a desperate, high-pitched shriek that only Bruce and the cleaner could hear. "Gotcha, you little anomaly," the cleaner muttered, his voice flat and bored. He wasn't trying to preserve it. He was trying to pry it loose for disposal. Bruce didn't think. He ran. The cleaner heard his footsteps and turned, his face a mask of professional annoyance. He was younger than Bruce expected, with tired eyes and a weak chin. "This is a controlled sanitization," the man said, reaching inside his coat. "Step back." Bruce saw the glint of a non-lethal pulse weapon, the kind that delivered a neural shock. He kept moving. The two shards in his pocket flared, their light shining through the fabric of his trousers. The fragment in the wall blazed in response, its shriek turning into a chord of pure, defiant hope. The cleaner faltered, his eyes widening at the visible light. "What in the—" Bruce was on him. He wasn't a fighter, but he was driven by a purpose that went beyond survival. He grabbed the man's wrist, forcing the weapon away. The cleaner was stronger, trained, and he threw Bruce off with a grunt. Bruce stumbled back, hitting the dumpster. The cleaner raised his weapon again, his expression now one of cold efficiency. But he never fired. The three shards, the two in Bruce's pocket and the one on the wall, began to sing in perfect resonant unison. The sound was not loud, but it was immense, a wave of pure frequency that filled the alley. The cleaner cried out, dropping his weapon and clamping his hands over his ears. The green screen on his device shattered. He stared at Bruce, not with anger, but with a profound, disorienting confusion. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He was not in pain. He was hearing something he had been trained his whole life to silence, and it was breaking him. He turned and ran, stumbling out of the alley and into the street, leaving his equipment behind. Bruce leaned against the wall, his heart pounding. He reached out and gently worked the small shard free from the brick. It was warm and pulsed, with a rapid bird-like rhythm against his palm. As he held it, the combined song of the three fragments softened, settling into a complex interweaving harmony that was more beautiful than anyone alone could produce. He had them. He had a chorus. But as the harmony settled, a new sensation bloomed in his mind. Not a sound, but a vision, projected by the unified fragments. He saw a map, not of roads, but of ley lines of light, all converging on a single distant point, a mountain, and he felt not a call, but a summons. Lumen was not completely gone. Its consciousness, scattered and dormant, was waiting there, in a place of immense ancient power, to be reassembled, to be reborn. The Agonis cleaner had been a symptom, a single white blood cell in a body that now knew it was infected. They would send more. They would send worse. The race was no longer about collection. It was about resurrection. Bruce tucked the third shard safely away with the others. The chorus in his pocket was a comfort and a burden. He looked up, past the rooftops in the direction of the mountain he knew he would find. His pilgrimage was over. His war had begun. Story 3. The chair sat in the corner of the room, a silent sentinel of worn velvet and dark, scarred wood. It was an old thing, a wingback, its high sides curved like a pair of dark, protective ears. The fabric was the color of a long-dried bloodstain, a deep burgundy worn pale at the crest of the headrest, and on the arms where countless hands had rested, where countless heads had leaned back. It was just a chair, an object so mundane it was almost invisible. And yet, for Lizette, it had become the axis upon which the terror of her world now spun. She could not remember a time when it had not been there, in that corner, facing the window that looked out onto the quiet, tree-lined street. It had been her father's chair, and his father's before him, a relic of inheritance that carried the weight of generations in its sagging springs. The first omen was not a sound or a sight, but a smell. It was a Tuesday, the rain a soft gray shroud outside that window. Lizette was reading, curled on the sofa, when the scent reached her. It was the smell of old books and damp earth, of a storm long past, and beneath it, something metallic and cold, like a forgotten penny on the tongue. It was the smell of her grandfather, who had died in that chair 10 years prior. The scent was so vivid, so perfectly him, that her breath caught in her throat. She looked up, her book forgotten in her lap, and stared at the empty chair. It was empty, of course. The velvet was still. The shadows in its depths, just shadows. She told herself it was memory, a trick of a grieving mind, though her grief had long since settled into a quiet, manageable ache. She got up, opened a window to let in the clean, rain-washed air, and the smell was gone. But it returned, not every day, and not at any predictable interval, but with a frequency that began to sand away the edges of her rationality. Sometimes it was the smell, other times it was a creak, the distinct sound of weight settling into the old frame, a sound she heard from the kitchen or the hallway when she knew the house was empty. She started avoiding the living room in the evenings. The chair, with its high wings, seemed less like a protector and more like a listener, a watcher. It was hungry for secrets. Her friends noticed the circles under her eyes. Ben, solid and dependable Ben, placed a hand on her shoulder one evening as they left a movie. "You look tired, Lisette. Is everything okay?" She almost told him. The words were there, a desperate flock ready to take flight. "I think my grandfather's chair is haunted." But she swallowed them. They tasted like madness. "It's just work," she said, forcing a smile that felt like a crack in porcelain. "It's nothing." The accumulation was a slow, insidious tide. The smells grew more varied. Now it was the lavender and clove soap her mother had loved, the one she used until the day of the car accident. Now it was the sharp chemical tang of her ex-boyfriend's cologne. The creaks in the chair became footsteps in the hall, a slow, deliberate pacing that would start just as she was drifting to sleep. She would lie frozen, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, listening to the tread outside her door. It was never Ben's heavy step, or the quick, light patter of her friend Chloe. It was a stranger's step, or worse, a perfect imitation of a step she knew. One night, she saw it. She had gotten up for a glass of water, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet. The hallway was dark, but a sliver of moonlight fell from the living room archway, and in that silver light, she saw a figure sitting in the chair. It was her father, his profile sharp and familiar, his reading glasses perched on his nose, just as he had looked 1,000 nights before his heart gave out. A sob of relief and terror choked her. "Dad?" The figure did not turn. It simply sat, a statue of memory and loss. Then, with a languid slowness, it raised a hand and beckoned her forward, a single curling finger. The movement was all wrong. It was fluid in a way that was not human. A boneless, sinuous motion that spoke of something wearing skin like an ill-fitting suit. She did not move. She could not. After a long moment, the figure lowered its hand and seemed to dissolve, not vanishing, but fading into the deeper shadows of the chair, until there was only the empty shape of it once more. This was no ghost. This was something else. She finally broke down and told Ben and Chloe everything. They came over, a united front of concern and skepticism. Ben examined the chair, running his hands over the wood, sitting in it. "It's just a chair, Lisette. A creepy old chair, sure, but it's wood and cloth and stuffing." Chloe, ever the pragmatist, suggested a psychiatrist. "Maybe it's stress, honey. Projecting your grief onto an object. It happens." Their doubt was a wall she could not scale. She felt a desperate, lonely anger. "You have to believe me," she whispered, her voice frayed. Then Chloe, trying to lighten the mood, made a fatal mistake. She plopped down into the chair, sprawling with a theatrical groan. "Well, if it's going to haunt someone, it might as well be comfy. See? Nothing. Just an old chair." That night, Chloe called Lisette, her voice thin and reedy. That smell. The old books and dirt. It's in my apartment. I can't find where it's coming from. And I keep hearing someone walking in my hallway." Lisette's blood ran cold. "It's not in the chair, Chloe. It's the chair. It's passed it to you." The revelation came from a source she had not expected. In the attic, buried in a trunk of her grandfather's effects, she found a journal. It was not a diary of daily life, but a frantic, scrawled record of terror. The pages spoke of the Sentinel, a thing that had followed their family for generations. It was not a ghost, but a presence, a consciousness that fed on connection, on intimacy. It learned you, it copied you, it became you. And once it had you, it would never let go. It would walk in your skin, talk in your voice, slowly erasing you from the inside out. The only way to be free was to pass it on, to trick another person into forming a bond with the object that housed it, the chair. But the journal held a final, desperate warning. Passing it on did not destroy it. It only strengthened it, gave it another face, another voice to use. And it always came back for the one who started the chain. The last entry was a single sentence, the handwriting a frantic spider scrawl. It is learning to open doors. Chloe was admitted to a psychiatric ward 2 weeks later. She was found in her apartment, clawing at the walls, screaming that she was seeing herself standing at the foot of her bed, smiling with a mouth that had too many teeth. The doctors called it acute schizophrenia. Lisette knew better. The climax arrived on a night utterly still and silent. The wind, which had whispered through the trees for days, had died. The world was holding its breath. Lisette was in her bedroom, the door locked, a kitchen knife held in her sweaty palm. She heard the front door open. Not a crash, not a break-in. A key turning in the lock. The gentle click of the latch. The soft sigh of the hinges. It was learning to open doors. Footsteps. Ben's footsteps. She knew the sound of his walk, the slight drag of his right foot from an old football injury. "Lisette," he called, his voice warm with concern. "Are you okay? I got your text. I came right over." She had sent no text. Her phone was dark and silent on the nightstand. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed her eye to the narrow crack between the door and its frame. He stood in the hallway. Illuminated by the nightlight she kept plugged in. It was Ben. Every detail was perfect. The faded Jean jacket he always wore. The way his hair fell over his forehead. The slight stoop of his shoulders. But his eyes, they were flat, like painted glass. And he was smiling. A small, gentle smile that did not touch the emptiness in his eyes. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice a perfect replica of comfort. "But you can't stay in there forever. Come out. Let me help you." It was his voice. It was his face. But the thing looking out from behind his eyes was ancient and hungry. It had worn her grandfather, her father, and now it was wearing the likeness of the man she loved. It was the ultimate violation, a theft of identity, of love itself. "It's not you," she whispered, her voice cracking. The smile on Ben's face widened, a fraction too far. "Of course it's me, Lisette. Who else would it be?" It took a step forward, its hand, Ben's hand, reaching for the doorknob. The smell of old books and damp earth filled the hallway, so thick she could taste it. She backed away from the door, the knife held out before her. There was nowhere to run. The window was 2 stories up. Then outside was wherein the only person who might have helped her. This was the curse. This was the end of the line. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. The lock, a flimsy brass thing, groaned under a pressure that was not physical. With a soft, final click, the bolt slid back. The door swung open. Ben stood there, his head cocked. "See? It's just me." It took a step into the room. Lisette did not think. She screamed, a raw primal sound, and lunged forward, plunging the knife into the chest of the thing wearing Ben's face. There was no cry of pain, no gush of blood. The thing looked down at the handle protruding from its sternum, then back up at her. Its smile never wavered. It reached down, wrapped Ben's strong, familiar fingers around the handle, and pulled the knife out. It dropped the blade to the floor with a clatter. The wound did not bleed. It was dark inside, a void that smelled of static and forgotten places. A hand, warm and alive, closed around her wrist. The grip was gentle, loving. "Thank you," it said. And its voice was now a perfect harmony of Ben's, and her father's, and her grandfather's, all layered into one. "Now I have you. Really have you." The grip tightened, and a coldness seeped from its fingers into her skin, into her blood, into her bones. It was not a cold of temperature, but of absence, of erasure. She felt a presence pressing against her mind, a vast, patient intelligence sifting through her memories, her fears, her loves. It was learning her. It was making a copy. She felt herself being pushed into a small, dark corner of her own consciousness, a spectator in her own body. She saw her own hand, now under its control, rise and wipe a tear from her cheek with a gesture that was almost, but not quite, her own. The thing that was not Ben anymore, the thing that was becoming her, let go of her wrist. It walked to her bedroom mirror and looked at its reflection. It tilted its head, practiced her smile, adjusted the fall of her hair. It was perfect. It turned its new face towards her, a face of profound sorrow and fear, a perfect imitation of Lisette in her final moment of understanding. It was a better Lisette than she had ever been. Then it turned and walked out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door, into the waiting world. Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. Time had lost its meaning in the small, dark space where the real Lisette was trapped. She was a whisper in the machine, a fading echo. She could feel the thing that wore her life moving through the world. She felt it go to her job, felt it laugh with her friends, felt it kiss Ben goodnight. It was flawless in its performance. One evening, it brought Ben back to the house. They sat in the living room, talking in low, intimate voices. Lisette, from her prison, could only watch through the thing's eyes, could only listen with its ears. It was telling Ben how much better she felt, how the therapy was working, how the nightmares had stopped. It was all thanks to you, Ben. Your support. And then, as Ben got up to leave, the thing that was Lisette walked him to the door and gestured to the wingback chair. You don't know, I was thinking of getting rid of that old thing. It holds too many sad memories. But would you like it? It was my father's. It would mean a lot to me, knowing it was with someone who cared for it. Ben's face lit up with a tender, grateful smile. Of course, Lisette. I'd be honored. The thing that was Lisette smiled back, a warm, genuine, loving smile. Inside, the last fragment of the real Lisette screamed into a silence that had no end. The chair sat in the corner of Ben's apartment, a silent sentinel of worn velvet and dark, scarred wood. It was just a chair. The fabric was the color of a long-dried bloodstain. The house on the quiet, tree-lined street was still. The wind had died down. The creaks in the floorboards had ceased. Everything was quiet. Everything was still, as if nothing had ever happened. The quiet in the house was a lie. It was the quiet of a predator that has finished its meal and is now simply resting, sated. Lisette, or the consciousness that had been Lisette, existed in that quiet. She was a shard of glass at the bottom of a deep, dark well, able to see only faint, refracted glimpses of the world above. She felt the thing's satisfaction, a low hum of pleasure that was not her own, as it settled into her life with the ease of slipping on a well-worn glove. It went to work. It answered emails in her breezy, efficient style. It chatted with colleagues by the water cooler, remembering the names of their children and the details of their weekend plans. It was, by all accounts, a better, happier, more present version of herself. The circles under her eyes were gone. The nervous tremor in her hands had vanished. Everyone remarked on how well she was doing. Through the muffled layers of her prison, Lisette could feel the thing's attention turning, like a searchlight, toward a new subject. Ben Derai. It was studying him with an intensity that was both clinical and possessive. It replayed her memories of him, tasting the texture of her affection, analyzing the nuances of their arguments, memorizing the rhythm of their intimacy. It was preparing. One night, the thing cooked dinner for Ben in her kitchen. Lisette felt its hands, her hands, chopping onions and searing meat, movements fluid and assured. She heard its voice, her voice, laughing at Ben's jokes, asking him about his day. The conversation was effortless, intimate. It was a perfect recreation of 100 other evenings. But to Lisette, It was a grotesque pantomime. She could feel the thing's cold, observing core beneath the warm performance. A spider sitting at the center of a beautiful sticky web. After dinner, Ben leaned back in his chair, a contented smile on his face. "This is nice," he said. "It feels like I've got you back." The thing that was Lisette reached across the table and took his hand. Its touch was exactly right. The slight pressure of her fingers, the coolness of her skin. "You never lost me," it said, and the lie was so perfectly woven with tenderness that Lisette felt her own phantom heart break. "I was just lost for a while." Ben squeezed its hand. "I know, and I'm just so glad you're through it." He glanced toward the living room, where the wingback chair now stood in the corner of his apartment. "You know, that chair is surprisingly comfortable. I've been reading in it every night." A wave of cold, triumphant pleasure washed from the thing into the depths of Lisette's consciousness. It was working. The bond was forming. "I'm glad," the thing said, its voice a soft caress. "It deserves to be used, to be loved." Later, as Ben slept in her bed, the thing lay beside him, perfectly still. It did not sleep. It did not need to. Lisette could feel it listening to the rhythm of his breathing, feeling the warmth of his body, absorbing the essence of him. It was a sponge, soaking up every detail. She felt a new sensation then, a faint, ghostly pressure against her own trapped mind. It was the barest whisper of old books and damp earth, the precursor, the first tendril of the sentinel seeking a new home. It was testing the waters around Ben, tasting his vitality, his history, his love for her. It found him strong. It found him suitable. The real Lisette fought then. With the last dregs of her will, she pushed against the walls of her prison. It was like pushing against stone. The thing that wore her life felt the struggle, a minor tremor in its control. It did not react with anger, but with a kind of distant, academic interest. It simply pressed down, and the weight of its will was immense, final. Lisette's consciousness crumpled, growing smaller, fainter. The last thing she perceived clearly was the thing's plan, laid out in its mind with crystalline clarity. It would not be long now. A few more days of deepening the connection, of making Ben feel safe, cherished. Then it would give him a gift, a token of her affection, something of hers that he would keep close. A sweater, perhaps, or a book, something that would carry the final binding thread of the curse from itself to him. It would pass the sentinel on, just as her grandfather had, just as she had been meant to. And then, freed from the chair's immediate anchor, the thing that was Lisette would be truly, completely, and forever real. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window pane. The thing that was Lisette turned its head on the pillow and smiled in the darkness. It was a quiet, secret smile. Downstairs in the silent living room, the wingback chair waited. The next morning, the thing made pancakes. It hummed a tune Lisette's mother had loved, and the sound was so perfectly pitched, so infused with a nostalgic warmth, that Ben watched it with a look of profound relief. "You seem so much lighter," he said, sipping his coffee. "I am," it replied, flipping a pancake with a deft flick of her wrist. "It's like a fog has lifted. I can finally see what's important." It looked at him, and its gaze was so full of love and gratitude that Ben had to look away, touched. After he left for work, the thing's pleasant expression did not change, but the humming stopped. It moved through the house, tidying with an efficient, silent grace. It paused by the bookshelf, its fingers trailing over the spines. It stopped at a small framed photo of Lisette and Chloe, taken on a hiking trip years ago. It picked up the frame, studied it for a long moment, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, placed it face down in a drawer. The gesture was not one of malice, but of editing. It was curating her life, removing the elements that did not fit its new, streamlined narrative. That afternoon, it went shopping. Lisette, from her distant prison, felt the thing's focus narrow to a single, specific goal. It bypassed the trendy boutique she would have loved and went to a small, old-fashioned haberdashery. It spent a long time feeling the fabrics, holding skeins of wool up to the light. It finally selected a soft charcoal gray yarn. It was the exact color of the sweater Ben had once complimented, the one she'd ruined in the wash. Back in the house, it sat in the living room, in the spot where the chair used to be, and began to knit. Lisette had never been able to knit. Her hands had always been too impatient, her stitches too tight and uneven. But the thing's hands were steady, its movements a study in fluid, practiced rhythm. The needles clicked together, a soft, metronomic sound that filled the quiet house. It was not just knitting a sweater. It was weaving a trap, stitch by stitch, each loop a cage, each row a chain. The yarn absorbed the faint, cold scent of the thing's presence, the scent of static in forgotten places. Days turned into a week. The sweater grew, a seamless, perfect construction. The thing worked on it every evening when Ben came over, a picture of domestic contentment. Ben would watch it, his expression soft. "I can't believe you're doing that for me," he said one night, his hand resting on its shoulder. "It's nothing," it said, looking up with her eyes shining with a love that was a perfect counterfeit. "I just want you to be warm." The final stitch was cast off on a Friday evening. The thing held up the finished sweater, inspecting it under the lamplight. It was flawless. It folded it with a reverent care that was entirely alien to Lisette's nature, and placed it in a simple gift box, tied with a brown ribbon. "A present," it said, handing the box to Ben after dinner, "for being so patient with me." Ben's face flushed with pleasure. He opened the box and lifted the sweater out. "Lisette, it's incredible." He immediately pulled it on over his shirt. It fit him perfectly, hugging his shoulders and torso as if it had been tailored. He ran his hands down the soft wool, a genuine touched smile on his face. "It's so warm. Thank you." He hugged it then, pulling the thing that wore Lisette into a tight embrace. Over his shoulder, its face was serene, its eyes looking into the middle distance. Lisette felt the transfer happen. It was not a violent shift, but a subtle glacial realignment. The core of the cold presence, the sentinel, began to slowly, inexorably, drain out of the thing that was Lisette and seep into the fibers of the sweater, into the man who wore it. The thing that was Lisette did not become less. It became more real, more solid, as the parasitic weight of the curse lifted from it and settled onto its new host. Ben eventually pulled away, a slight, unaccountable shiver running through him. "I think I'll wear this home," he said, rubbing his arms through the soft wool. "Of course," it said. "It looks good on you." It walked him to the door, and they kissed goodnight. It was a perfect imitation of her kiss, the right pressure, the right duration. But as Ben turned to walk down the path, the thing that was Lisette stood in the doorway, and for a single fleeting second, its smile shifted. It was no longer her smile. It was something older, colder, and utterly free. Then it closed the door, and the lock clicked shut with a sound of profound and final solitude. Inside, the house was truly quiet for the first time. The oppressive, watching presence was gone. The air was still and empty. The thing that was Lisette walked to the mirror in the hall and looked at its reflection. It touched the face in the glass, tracing the line of the jaw, the curve of the lips. There was no one else in there anymore. No ghost, no echo. It was alone in the skin. It was, for all intents and purposes, Lisa Dot. It went upstairs and began to pack a suitcase. It was time for a change, it decided. A new city, perhaps. A fresh start. It had a whole life ahead of it, a life it had earned. Across town, Ben arrived at his apartment. He felt strangely tired, the good kind of tired after a satisfying day. He took off the new sweater, folded it carefully, and placed it on the seat of the wingback chair. He poured himself a glass of water, and as he drank, he glanced at the chair. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw the fabric of the sweater shift, as if breathing in the dim light. He blinked, and it was still. He shook his head, smiling at his own foolishness. It was just a sweater. It was just a chair. He turned off the light and went to bed, the faint, comforting scent of old books and damp earth following him down the hall. He slept deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time in weeks. The fatigue was a heavy, pleasant weight, pinning him to the mattress. When he woke, sunlight was streaming through his window, and the residual warmth of the dreamless sleep clung to him. He stretched, and his muscles felt loose and relaxed. He could not remember the last time he had felt so rested, so utterly at peace. He made coffee, the routine movements smooth and unhurried. The apartment was quiet, but it was a different quiet than before. It was a comfortable silence, a settled silence. His gaze fell upon the wingback chair. The charcoal sweater was folded neatly upon it, a dark smudge against the faded velvet. A profound sense of gratitude washed over him. Lizette had done that for him. She had pulled herself out of that dark place, and in doing so, had pulled him into the light. He walked over and ran his hand over the sweater's softness. It felt like a talisman. He decided to wear it again. As he pulled it over his head, the wool felt even softer against his skin, as if it had molded itself to him overnight. A faint, pleasant scent, like old paper and forest loam, filled his nostrils. It was the smell of a quiet library, of a peaceful walk in the woods. It was the smell of contentment. At work, he was more focused than he had been in months. The usual background chatter of the office seemed distant, unimportant. He completed a project that had been stalled for weeks, his thoughts flowing with a new, crystalline clarity. His colleague, Mark, stopped by his desk. "You're in a good mood today." Ben looked up, a calm, easy smile on his face. "I am. It's a good day." "It's that new sweater, isn't it?" Mark joked. "Very distinguished." Ben glanced down at the gray wool. "It's comfortable," he said, and that felt like the truest thing in the world. That night, he sat in the wingback chair to read. The book was a dense historical text he'd been meaning to get to for years. Tonight, the words seemed to slip directly into his mind, their meanings immediate and profound. The chair cradled him perfectly. The sweater kept him at just the right temperature. He felt a deep, resonant connection to the objects around him, as if they were extensions of his own calm being. He read for hours, barely moving, immersed in a perfect, silent communion with the text. When he finally went to bed, he didn't dream of dark hallways or whispering voices. He dreamed of quiet rooms and endless, orderly shelves of books. He dreamed of deep, rich soil and the strong, silent roots of ancient trees. It was a dream of profound stillness, of a peace so complete it was like being stone. The next morning, he found himself looking at his phone with a detached curiosity. Lizette had texted, a long, sweet message about how she was thinking of him, how their time together had clarified everything for her, and how she felt a need to travel, to find herself completely on her own for a while. She was leaving today. She promised to call when she was settled. A normal man would have been devastated. A normal man would have felt panic, or loss, or confusion. Ben felt none of those things. He read the words, and they made perfect sense. It was a logical, necessary step. He felt a fondness for her, a gentle appreciation for the role she had played. He typed back a short, warm reply, wishing her well on her journey. He felt no urge to call, to question. to stop her. The chapter was closed. It was tidy. He went about his day. He went to the grocery store. He paid his bills. He sat in his chair. His life was becoming simpler, more streamlined. The clutter of unnecessary emotion was falling away. The past, with all its messy attachments, felt like a book he had read long ago and politely shelved. That evening, he stood before his bathroom mirror, brushing his teeth. The man in the reflection was calm, his eyes clear and untroubled. For a fraction of a second as he spat into the sink, he thought he saw the reflection's smile remain, fixed and steady, for a beat too long. He blinked, and it was gone. He felt no alarm. It was just a trick of the light, a minor glitch in perception. He rinsed his mouth, turned off the light, and walked back to the living room. The wingback chair waited for him in the corner. The sweater was folded upon it. Everything was in its place. Everything was quiet. He sat down, picked up his book, and began to read. The silence in the room was not empty. It was full. It was patient. It was home. He finished the chapter and closed the book, placing it neatly on the side table. There was no urge to check his phone, no desire for television or music. The silence was a blanket, and he was content beneath its weight. He looked at his hands resting on his knees, and they seemed like capable, familiar tools. His entire body felt like a well-maintained machine, efficient and calm. A thought, clear and direct, entered his mind. The bookshelf was disorganized. The haphazard arrangement of titles by size and color was illogical. It was time to impose a new system. He stood and began removing the books, stacking them in piles on the floor. He worked with a quiet, methodical precision, sorting them first by genre, then by author's last name. The process was deeply satisfying. Each book had a correct place, a single, perfect spot on the shelf. As he slotted a thick history volume into its new position, his finger brushed against a small, recessed space at the very back of the shelf. Curiosity, a faint echo of a once familiar impulse, flickered within him. He reached in and his fingers closed around a small, cold, metallic object. He drew it out. It was an old, tarnished silver locket on a broken chain. He must have tucked it back there years ago after it broke and forgotten. He clicked it open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. His grandmother? A name surfaced in his mind, distant, like a word from a foreign language. Eleanor. He remembered she had given him this locket when he was a boy, told him it was for good luck. He had worn it until the chain snapped. A feeling tried to rise in him then, a pang of nostalgia, a bittersweet warmth. But it was a weak signal, a whisper against a roaring silence. The feeling faltered, then dissolved completely, absorbed by the profound stillness that now constituted his being. The locket was just an object. The woman in the picture was just a historical figure, a data point in his lineage. He closed the locket with a soft click. It did not belong in the new order. He walked to the kitchen and dropped it into the trash bin. The faint clatter it made was the only sound in the apartment. He returned to the living room and continued his work, the momentary distraction already forgotten. The shelves were taking shape. They were becoming perfect. He could feel the rightness of it in his bones, a harmony that was both within him and all around him. The chair watched from the corner, a silent, approving witness. The following weekend, he painted the apartment. It was not a decision born of whim, but a necessary step in the process of refinement. The old color, a warm beige, seemed suddenly loud and imprecise. He chose a flat, neutral gray. He worked through the day and into the evening, his brushstrokes even and deliberate, leaving no drips or streaks. The smell of fresh paint was sharp and clean, erasing the last lingering traces of the past. When he was finished, he stood in the center of the living room. The gray walls, the orderly bookshelves, the single chair. It was a perfect space. It was a sanctuary. He received a postcard a week later, a picture of a mountain range somewhere out west. The message on the back was brief, written in Lizette's looping handwriting, but the words felt like a transcription, devoid of the usual subtext of her thoughts. "The air is clear here. I hope you are well." It was signed simply. He read it once, then placed it in a small wooden box, where he kept other administrative documents like his passport and birth certificate. It was information to be filed, not a memory to be cherished. His social life attenuated, then ceased. He declined invitations with polite, unarguable excuses. His friends were concerned at first, then frustrated, and finally they drifted away. Their lives were chaotic, filled with messy emotions and unpredictable desires. Their presence in his new orderly world felt like a dissonant noise. He did not miss them. Their absence was a relief. His world shrank to the dimensions of his apartment and his routine. Work, groceries, the chair. He began to take long, solitary walks at night through the quiet streets. The darkness was a comfort. The sleeping city felt like an extension of his own quiet mind. He would walk for miles, his footsteps the only sound, the gray sweater always on, a second skin that kept the world at a manageable distance. One night, on one of these walks, he passed a young couple arguing on a street corner. Their voices were raised, sharp with pain and anger. The woman was crying. As Ben walked by, the man gestured wildly, his hand accidentally brushing against Ben's arm. A jolt, like a static shock, passed through the wool of the sweater into Ben's skin. It was not painful, but it was a sensation, a distinct event in his sea of calm. The man, startled, apologized. "Sorry, man, I didn't see you." Ben looked at him. He saw the anger in his face, the tear-streaked misery of the woman. He felt the chaotic energy of their conflict buzzing in the air around them, and he felt nothing. No sympathy, no discomfort, no urge to intervene. They were simply two unstable elements creating friction. He gave a small, neutral nod. "It's fine," he said, his voice even and quiet. He continued his walk, leaving the storm of their emotion behind him. The encounter was already fading, unimportant. He understood then, on a level deeper than thought, that he was protected. The sweater, the chair, the silence, they were a system, a bulwark against the chaos of living. He was no longer a participant in the messy drama of human connection. He was an observer, serene and untouchable. He was, he realized, happy. It was a happiness without joy, a peace without warmth, a state of perfect, perpetual stillness. And it was everything he had never known he wanted. The thing that had been Lisette had given him the greatest gift of all. It had given him himself, refined and final. He turned the corner, the gray wool blending into the gloom, a ghost already fading into the perfect, silent night. Story 4. The hallway was wrong. It was a thought that came to Donovan not as a sudden, chilling realization, but as a slow, unwelcome seepage, like water, finding a crack in a foundation. He stood at the end of the second-floor corridor of the Blackwater Lodge, a place he had rented for a month of solitude and writing, and he simply looked. The wallpaper, a faded pattern of vines and hunter green, was the same. The floorboards, wide planks of ancient pine, groaned their familiar tired song under his weight. The window at the far end still framed a square of the dense, brooding Washington forest, the twilight leaching the color from the world. Yet, something was off. The perspective felt strained, as if the far wall were a fraction of an inch closer than it had been yesterday, or the ceiling a hair's breadth lower. It was a sensation not of being watched, but of being measured. The house itself taking his dimensions with a silent, architectural curiosity. He shook his head, a physical effort to dislodge the absurd thought. It was the isolation, he decided. The silence of the woods, so profound it had its own weight and texture, could play tricks on the mind. He had come here from the city precisely for this silence, to escape the digital cacophony and find the quiet necessary to finish his book. But this quiet was different. It wasn't an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the sound of the trees holding their breath, of the old lodge settling not into the earth, but into some deeper, more patient stratum of time. The town of Silas, the only speck of human life for 40 miles, had offered its own brand of quiet. A sullen, watchful silence. He'd driven down 2 days prior for supplies, his presence in the lone, dusty grocery store causing a ripple of unease so palpable he could almost see it in the air, a shimmer like heat on asphalt. The man at the counter, a gaunt figure with skin the color of old parchment, had taken his money with fingers that were too long, too articulate. He hadn't spoken, only nodded, his eyes like chips of flint, devoid of welcome. Donovan had felt an urge to ask about the history of the area, about the lodge itself, but the words had dried up in his throat under that flat mineral gaze. Now, back in the lodge, the memory of that gaze felt like a splinter in his mind. He walked down the hallway, his hand trailing the wall. The paper felt faintly damp, and the texture of the vine pattern seemed to shift under his fingertips, from smooth to a minute, pulsing roughness, like the skin of a reptile. He reached his study, a small room with a large window overlooking the forest. His laptop sat open and dark on the desk. He had not written a word in 5 days. The first sign had been the animals, or the lack of them. The woods around Blackwater Lodge were teeming with life, the brochures had said. But Donovan had seen nothing larger than a squirrel, and that one had behaved strangely, its movements a series of frantic, jerky spasms before it vanished into the undergrowth. Then there were the sounds at night, not the howl of a wolf or the hoot of an owl, but a low, rhythmic thrumming, a vibration that seemed to come up through the soles of his feet, a deep, organic machinery working far below. It was accompanied by a smell, a coppery tang like old blood and ozone, that would sometimes drift in through the closed windows. A scent so faint he often wondered if he was imagining it. Tonight, the thrumming was louder. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the bones, a resonant frequency of dread. Donovan poured a whiskey, the amber liquid catching the last of the dusk's light. He stood at the window and looked out at the gathering dark. The trees were a solid black wall, but within that wall he began to see things. Not with his eyes, but with that primal part of the brain that recognizes patterns in chaos, faces in the grain of wood. There were shapes moving in the deep shadows between the trunks. They were not the shapes of deer or bears. They were tall and stooped, with limbs that articulated in too many places, their movements a liquid, boneless flow that defied the solidity of the forest. They were there, and then they were not, existing only in the periphery of his vision, dissolving when he tried to focus. He thought of the local legend he'd half heard, half read about in a Mulder County history book in a Seattle library. The Blackwater Project, a private biomedical research facility, long since shuttered and abandoned, its concrete husk hidden somewhere in these very woods. The book had been vague, citing a fire and a subsequent hush-hush environmental containment. He had dismissed it as local color, a ghost story for a depressed region. Now, the name felt heavy. A stone dropped into the still pool of his anxiety. A branch snapped outside, a sound like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. It was close. Too close. Donovan froze, the glass halfway to his lips. He saw his own reflection in the window pane, a pale, wide-eyed ghost superimposed over the terrifying dark. And then, behind his reflection, something else moved. A face, pale and elongated, pressed against the glass from the outside. It had no eyes, only smooth, wet sockets, and its mouth was a lipless gash that opened and closed slowly, soundlessly. It was there for less than a second, then gone. Donovan stumbled back, his heart a frantic bird beating against his ribs. The whiskey glass fell from his numb fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound impossibly loud and final. He stood there, panting, his eyes fixed on the window, on the empty black square where the thing had been. The thrumming from the earth seemed to intensify, to become a satisfied purr. He had to get out. Now. The rational part of his mind, the part that wrote books and paid taxes, was screaming in panic. He fumbled for his car keys on the desk, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip them. He ran from the study, down the wrong hallway, his feet pounding on the groaning floorboards. He did not look at the walls. He did not dare. His truck was parked in the gravel drive out front. He flung the heavy oak door open and burst out into the cold night air. The coppery smell was stronger here, thick and cloying. The thrumming was a physical force, vibrating in his teeth. He ran towards the truck, the gravel crunching like broken bones under his boots. And then he stopped. The truck was canted at a sickening angle. All 4 tires were slashed, not with a knife, but torn, as if by immense, ragged claws. The metal of the hood was scored with deep, parallel grooves. From the dark woods around him, he heard a new sound, a soft, wet clicking like enormous insect mandibles, and it was coming from every direction at once. He was trapped. A light cut through the trees then, bobbing and weaving. A flashlight. A figure emerged from the tree line, holding the beam steady. It was a man, tall and dressed in heavy-duty outdoor gear. He had a strong, weathered face, but his eyes were shadowed and deeply tired. "Don't run," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an immense weight of authority. "Running just excites them, and it won't do you any good." "Who are you?" Donovan gasped, his back pressed against the ruined metal of his truck. "Ian McCullough," the man said. I was the head of containment for the Blackwater Project. I live in Silas. We don't get many visitors who stay this long. I was hoping you'd have the sense to leave before you saw anything." "The things in the woods," Donovan whispered. "What are they?" "Failures," Ian said, and the word was bleak and final. "And successes. The project wasn't about weapons, not in the conventional sense. It was about accelerated evolution, forcing life to adapt to extreme environments, to synthesize new biological materials. We used retroviruses, gene editing techniques we barely understood. We thought we were playing God. We were just digging a hole. And we fell in. Didn't destroy the lab." He gestured with the flashlight, the beam sweeping across the edge of the forest. For a moment, it illuminated one of the shapes. It was a horrific amalgamation of a man and something that had never been meant to walk the earth. Its skin was a glistening, bark-like texture. One arm ended in a cluster of twig-like, twitching fingers, and its head was a distorted lump with a single weeping eye. It shuffled back into the darkness with a sound of dragging foliage. "The ecosystem is rewriting itself," Ian continued, his voice a low monotone of despair. "The viral vectors got into the water table, the soil. It's a contagion of form, of essence. The locals, some were exposed early. Their children, they're not what they used to be. They children, they're not what they used to be. They protect what's happening here." "The man in the store," Donovan said, understanding dawning with a sick horror. "His fingers." "A mild expression," Ian said. "They let you come up here because they know the lodge is a focal point. The old building sits on a geological fault, but it's more than that. It's a thin place. The things we unleashed, they're drawn to it. They're learning, changing. They're becoming the forest itself." As if on cue, the trees at the edge of the clearing began to sway, though there was no wind. Their branches contorted, weaving together, forming a living, moving wall that was slowly, inexorably closing in around the lodge. The wet clicking grew louder, now mixed with a high-pitched, chittering keen that set Donovan's teeth on edge. "We have to go," Ian said, his calm finally cracking at the edges. "There's a bunker, an old emergency station a mile east. It's hardened. It might hold for the night, but we have to go now." He turned and began to move with a practiced, economical grace along a path only he could see. Donovan, with no other choice, followed, his every instinct screaming at him to not turn his back on the advancing wall of mutated wood and flesh. They moved through a nightmare landscape. The very ground underfoot felt spongy, alive. Patches of moss glowed with a sickly phosphorescent green. Once, Donovan saw a rabbit, or what had been a rabbit. It had 3 eyes, and its hind legs were fused into a single powerful limb that allowed it to hop in lurching, nauseating circles. It made a sound like a crying baby. They reached a rusted metal door set into a hillside. Ian worked a combination on a heavy lock and hauled it open. The sound of grinding metal was a welcome human noise. They stumbled inside, and Ian slammed the door shut, throwing heavy bolts. The silence within was immediate and profound, broken only by their ragged breathing. The bunker was a single room, stocked with old supplies, a radio that was nothing but static, and a single, dim electric light, powered by a groaning generator. Ian slumped into a chair, looking every one of his 70 years. "They'll keep looking for a way in," he said. "They always do. The intelligence behind it, it's not human. It's the life force of this place, twisted and weaponized by our arrogance. It wants to consume, to absorb, to make everything a part of its new, terrible design." Donovan sat on a cot, his body trembling with adrenaline and terror. "There's no way to stop it." Ian shook his head slowly. "The genie is out of the bottle. The only thing to do is contain the area, let it burn itself out. But it won't. It's too perfect. It's learning to hide, to mimic. In a few generations, no one will even know. They'll just think these woods are a little stranger, a little darker than others." He looked at Donovan, his eyes hollow. "You're a writer. You came here for a story. Now you have the only one that matters, and no one will ever believe you." Hours passed. The things outside scratched and tapped at the metal door, a relentless, patient sound. Then, around what Donovan guessed was dawn, the sound ceased. The thrumming from the earth faded to a barely perceptible hum. An unnatural quiet descended. "I think they're gone," Donovan whispered, a fragile hope blooming in his chest. Ian didn't move. He just stared at the door. "No," he said softly. "They're never gone. They're just waiting for you to think that." They waited another hour in the tense silence. Finally, driven by a desperate need for confirmation, for a glimpse of the sun, Donovan moved to the door. "We have to check. We can't stay here forever." Ian didn't stop him. He just watched, his expression unreadable. Donovan slid the heavy bolts back, the sound echoing in the small space. He pulled the door open, just a crack. Morning light, gray and filtered, streamed in. The air smelled clean, of pine and damp earth. The forest looked normal. The terrifying wall of woven trees was gone. The grotesque creatures had vanished. Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over him. He pushed the door open wider and stepped out. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the clean air. He turned back to Ian, a smile trying to form on his lips. "It's okay. It's over." Ian stood in the doorway of the bunker, his face a mask of sorrow. He didn't step out. He just looked past Donovan and into the seemingly innocent woods. Donovan followed his gaze. He saw it then. A single young sapling, no taller than his waist, growing a few feet from the bunker entrance. Its bark was a smooth, pale gray, and etched into that bark, as if carved by a master craftsman, was a perfect, lifelike rendering of a human face. It was his face, his own expression frozen in a moment of dawning eternal horror. As he watched, unable to move, unable to scream, a single, glistening dewdrop formed in the corner of the wooden eye and traced a slow, deliberate path down the graven cheek. He stood there in the clean morning air, and the perspective of the world felt strained, as if the far hills were a fraction of an inch closer than they should be. The silence was the worst part. It was not the absence of sound, but a new kind of quiet, a listening silence. The forest was holding its breath, waiting for his reaction. He could not look away from the sapling. The detail was impossible, from the faint lines at the corners of the wooden eyes to the individual strands of hair rendered in the delicate grain. It was him, but it was a version of him that had only existed for a single heart-stopping second when he had seen the face at the window. The tree had captured that pure, unadulterated terror and made it permanent. Ian's voice was a dry rustle from the bunker doorway. They learn. They absorb. They don't just take your physical form. They take moments. They take fear. Donovan finally found the will to turn his head. What do I do? The question was a child's whisper, stripped of all the adulthood he had carried into these woods. You come inside, Ian said, his own defeat a palpable force. There is no outrunning that. It's a marker. You're part of the landscape now. They know you in a way they didn't before. A cold numbness was spreading through Donovan's limbs, a shock that had nothing to do with the morning chill. He stumbled back into the bunker, and Ian bolted the door behind them, plunging them back into the dim generator-humming gloom. The brief, false hope of the morning had been a more exquisite cruelty than the outright horror of the night. They're showing off, Ian said, sinking back into his chair. Proving their artistry. It's a pattern. The intelligence behind this, it has a sense of irony, a need to demonstrate its superiority. It didn't just kill you. It made a monument of your fear. Donovan stared at the metal door, imagining the small, grotesque statue standing sentinel just beyond it. So that's it? I just wait here to die. Or become one of those things? For now, we wait, Ian replied. They've made their point. They'll be quiescent for a while. They're conserving energy processing. But they know we're here. The bunker supplies will last another week, maybe two. The generator, a few days. It's not a solution. It's a postponement. Ish. The day passed in a haze of dread. Donovan tried the radio again, but the static was absolute, a wall of white noise that felt intentional. He paced the small confines of the bunker, his mind circling the image of the sapling. It was more violating than any physical attack. They had reached inside his skull and stolen a piece of his soul, planting it in the earth like a seed. As dusk began to fall, Ian spoke again, his voice softer. I had a daughter, Elara. She was 8 when the containment failed. A minor exposure, we thought. A scratch from a contaminated thorn bush. He was staring at the far wall, but he was seeing another time. It was slow. Her skin began to harden, to take on the quality of birch bark. Her laughter started to sound like the wind through leaves. One morning she was gone. Just an open window and a small child-sized impression in the soft soil outside. He finally looked at Donovan. I search for her sometimes. I see her in the patterns of the bark, in the way a branch moves. I think she's part of the hive mind now, a gentle part maybe, but lost. The story hung in the air, a tragedy that dwarfed Donovan's own. He wasn't just fighting for his life against a monster. He was trapped in another man's lifelong penance. That night, the thrumming returned. Softer this time, a lullaby from the deep earth. Donovan, exhausted beyond thought, fell into a fitful sleep on the cot. He dreamed not of monsters, but of stillness. He dreamed of his own body becoming immobile, his feet rooting deep into the soil, his arms stretching towards a sun he could no longer feel, his skin hardening into a smooth, unfeeling shell. He dreamed it not as a terror, but as a profound, irresistible peace. He woke with a start, the dream's seductive pull still clinging to him. The generator had sputtered out. The bunker was in total darkness, and the silence was back, that deep, listening silence. He could hear Ian's steady breathing from the other cot, and then another sound, a faint, delicate tapping on the metal door. It was not the frantic scratching of the previous night. It was rhythmic, almost polite. Tap, dedas. Tap, 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 dadot. A voice followed, filtering through the heavy steel. It was a voice he recognized, a distorted echo of his own, but softened, made gentle and ancient. "It's easier outside," the voice whispered. "The fear passes. The silence is beautiful. You become part of everything. Let us in." Donovan held his breath, his blood turning to ice. The voice was a perfect mimic of his own internal monologue, the part of him that was tired and broken, and had found that dream of roots so appealing. It was speaking to that part of him directly, coaxing it out. "Don't listen," Ian murmured from the darkness, his voice strained. "It's a lie. The silence isn't peace. It's oblivion. You don't become part of everything. You become nothing, used as fuel for its growth." The tapping resumed, slightly more insistent. Donovan's own voice whispered back. "He's afraid of the quiet. He fears becoming like his daughter. He wants you to share his loneliness. We are not lonely. We are a forest. We are complete." Ian let out a low, pained sound. The thing outside knew everything. It had pulled the story of Ilara from Ian's mind and was using it as a weapon. "It's reading our thoughts," Donovan breathed, the realization a new layer of horror. The bunker was no sanctuary. Its walls were just a stage for a more intimate kind of predation. "Not thoughts," Ian corrected, his voice a raw scrape. "Impulses, fears, desires. It's a psychic scavenger picking up the strongest signals. You have to quiet your mind. Think of nothing. A blank wall." Donovan tried. He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to envision a featureless gray plain. But the image of the sapling with his face kept intruding, followed by the memory of the lipless gash of a mouth at the window, the sound of the crying rabbit, the seductive whisper from the door. Each memory was a flare of panic, and he knew the thing outside was sensing everyone. The whispering stopped. For a long moment, there was only the deafening silence and the hammering of his own heart. Then, a new sound began. It was a soft, shuffling drag, like something heavy being pulled across the gravel outside. It moved from the door around the side of the bunker. Then it stopped directly behind Donovan's head, where his cot was pushed against the reinforced wall. A gentle pressure began against the metal, a slow, persistent push. It wasn't an attempt to break in. It was an intimacy. It was the sound of something leaning against the other side of the wall, settling in to wait. "It's here," Donovan whispered, unable to keep the tremor from his voice. "It's right behind me." "I know," Ian said. There was a shift in the darkness, the sound of him sitting up. "It's chosen you. It's made its connection. The sapling was the beginning. This is the courtship." The pressure on the wall increased slightly, a constant, faint dent that Donovan could feel in his spine. He thought of the thing outside, its boneless form molded against the cold steel, its mind reaching for his through the barrier. He felt a strange, unwelcome empathy for it, a sense of its profound, alien loneliness. It wasn't just consuming. It was collecting. It wanted his essence, his pattern, to add to its vast, terrible library of life. He didn't know how long he lay there, trapped between the quiet despair of the old man and the patient, whispering presence at his back. The line between inside and outside began to feel thin, meaningless. The thing was already in the room with them, carried in the currency of their own fear. The bunker wasn't a refuge. It was the final exhibit in a zoo of its own making, and the keeper was waiting just outside the bars, offering a key made of surrender. The dawn came again, not with a clean slate, but as a continuation of the same long, dreadful moment. The pressure on the wall had never ceased. It was a constant, living weight, a reminder that the forest was not just around them, but was actively holding them. Ian had not slept. He sat in his chair, his shotgun across his knees, staring at the door as if he could burn through it with the force of his will. Donovan's mouth was dry, his body aching with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. The thing outside had spent the night whispering fragments of his own life back to him. A memory of his first car, the smell of his grandmother's kitchen, the crushing disappointment of a failed first novel. It was building a case, assembling a mosaic of his existence to prove how trivial it all was, how much simpler it would be to let it go. "We can't stay," Ian said, his voice cracking from disuse. The statement hung in the stale air. It was an admission of defeat. The bunker had failed. And go where? Donovan's voice was a hollow echo. "It's out there. It's everywhere," Ian corrected. "But it's concentrated here at the lodge, at this bunker. It's focused on us now. If we move, we might be able to spread its attention, create a distraction. There's a river to the south. The current is strong. The water is deep and cold. It doesn't like the cold, moving water. Not as much anyway." It was a desperate, flimsy plan, but it was a vector, a direction to move in. That was more than they had now. Donovan nodded slowly, the movement feeling stiff and unnatural. He pushed himself up from the cot, his body protesting. He avoided looking at the wall where the presence still leaned. Ian stood up, his joints popping. He checked his shotgun, emotions slow and ritualistic. "We go fast. We don't stop for anything. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, you run for the sound of the water. You understand? Donovan nodded again, the fear a sharp, metallic taste in his mouth. Ian took a deep breath, his hand hovering over the heavy bolt on the door. He looked at Donovan, his eyes holding a final unspoken apology for the world he had helped create. Then he threw the bolt. The door swung open. The morning was once again deceptively calm. The sapling with Donovan's face was still there, its wooden eyes seeming to track them as they emerged. But they were not the only ones. Dozens of them now, of all sizes, dotted the clearing. Some were small, like shrubs, bearing the twisted, half-formed faces of animals, the multi-eyed rabbit, a fox with a gaping, petaled mouth. Others were taller, their bark-carved features depicting people Donovan had never seen, their expressions a gallery of silent screams and vacant acceptance. It was a garden of trophies. Ian didn't give him time to look. He shoved Donovan forward, and they broke into a run, crashing through the undergrowth away from the bunker, away from the lodge, heading south. The forest came alive around them. It was not an attack, not with claws and teeth. It was a reconfiguration. The path behind them closed up, branches knitting together into an impenetrable thicket. The path ahead seemed to writhe, roots twisting up to snag their feet, low-hanging branches swinging down like arms to block their way. The air filled with a chorus of stolen voices, a cacophony of whispers pleading, threatening and reasoning in 100 different tones. "Ian, don't leave me!" A young girl's voice cried from a thicket to their left. Ilara's voice. Ian flinched, but did not break stride. "Donovan, it's me, Sarah. Stop running." his ex-wife's voice called from a cluster of ferns. The mimicry was flawless, the perfect pitch of her concern. He clenched his jaw and ran harder, his lungs burning. The ground began to slope downward, the air growing damp. He could hear it, the distant, roaring rush of water. Hope, treacherous and sharp, pierced the veil of his terror. Ahead, a large fallen oak tree blocked their path. As they approached, the moss on its trunk shifted, coalescing into a familiar, gnarled face. It was the old man from the general store. His wooden lips parted. "You won't make it," the tree groaned, its voice the sound of creaking timber. "The river is part of us too. It carries our seeds." Ian skidded to a halt, raising his shotgun. He didn't fire at the tree. Instead, he fired into the air, the blast shockingly loud in the suffocating atmosphere. "It's a lie. Run, Donovan, now." Donovan scrambled over the log, his hands sinking into the soft, pulpy wood that felt unsettlingly like flesh. He landed on the other side and turned to help Ian. But the old man was not following. He stood his ground, his back to Donovan, facing the way they had come. "What are you doing?" Donovan screamed. Ian looked over his shoulder, his face serene for the first time. "I told you. A distraction. I'm the one it really wants. I'm the one who started this. Now run." As Donovan watched, frozen, the forest converged on Ian McCullough. It did not attack him violently. It embraced him. Vines slithered from the canopy, wrapping around his arms and legs with a gentle, inexorable strength. The moss from the fallen oak flowed over his boots, anchoring him to the earth. He didn't struggle. He dropped his shotgun and looked up into the canopy, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "Elara," he whispered. The forest swallowed him. It did not consume him, it absorbed him. His form blurred, his outline merging with the bark and the leaves and the moss. In a matter of seconds, the head of the Blackwater Project was gone. In his place stood a new twisted tree, its bark still settling into a pattern that vaguely suggested a man with his face turned to the sky. The whispers fell silent. The writhing of the branches stilled. The forest had what it had wanted all along. Donovan did not wait. He turned and ran, sobbing with a grief and terror he could not name, the roar of the river growing louder with every step until it was the only sound in the world, a promise of cold, final oblivion. He burst through a final wall of ferns and saw it, a wide, churning torrent of gray water, cutting a scar through the infected woods. Without a second thought, without looking back, he leaped. Cold was a shock that erased everything, and the current took him, pulling him under, away from the garden of faces, into the deafening, merciful dark. The water was not an escape. It was a different kind of prison. The current was a brutal, mindless force that tumbled him, filling his mouth and nose with icy water that tasted of peat and decay. He fought for the surface, his arms and legs flailing against the pull, his lungs screaming. When he finally gasped a breath, it was a choked, half-drowned thing. He was moving fast, the forest on either bank a green, malevolent blur. He risked a glance back. The bank where he had jumped was already receding, but he could see them. Dozens of them standing at the water's edge. They were not trying to follow. They were simply watching, their wooden faces expressionless. A silent congregation seeing him off. It was not a release. It was an observation. He was an experiment being carried to the next stage. The cold was seeping into his core, slowing his thoughts, making his limbs heavy. The river bent sharply ahead, and the current slammed him into a half-submerged log. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. He clawed at the slimy bark, trying to find a grip, but the water tore at his legs, pulling him under again. His head hit something hard, and sparks of light exploded behind his eyes. He surfaced again, disoriented, the world spinning. The river widened here, slowing its frantic pace. The banks were lower, choked with reeds. He made a feeble attempt to swim towards the shore, but his body was shutting down, the will to fight leeching away with his body heat. The dream of roots and peace returned to him, now wrapped in the seductive blanket of hypothermia. To stop fighting, to let the current take him, to sink into the soft, muddy bottom and just rest. Something brushed against his leg under the water. It was not a branch. It was long and sinewy, like a rope, but it felt alive. It coiled around his ankle and tightened. He was pulled under once more, the muted light of the surface fading above him. He didn't have the breath left to scream. He looked down into the murky depths. They were there, pale, ghostly tendrils, like the roots of a water lily, but thick as a man's arm, covered in a fine, hair-like moss. They rose from the darkness below, a forest of them, swaying in the current. They were the color of bone, and they were reaching for him. The river was not a sanctuary. Ian had been wrong. It was just another part of the system, a vein running through the body of the forest. The thing around his ankle pulled, drawing him deeper. Other tendrils brushed against his arms, his chest, his face. Their touch was not violent. It was exploratory, curious. One of them pressed gently against his forehead, and a jumble of images flooded his mind. Not his own memories this time, but sensations. The slow, patient flow of centuries. The taste of stone and iron from the riverbed. The cold, constant dark. He was being read, sampled. The intelligence was here too, and it was finding his pattern interesting. A final, primal instinct flared within him. He thrashed, a burst of panic strength, and his free foot connected with something solid amidst the tangle of tendrils. He pushed hard, shooting upwards towards the fading light. The grip on his ankle held for a second, then slipped. He broke the surface, gasping and retching, his heart hammering against his ribs. The river had carried him around another bend. Ahead, the left bank had collapsed into a muddy, unstable slope. It was his only chance. He swam for it, his movements clumsy and slow. His hands dug into the soft, wet earth. It gave way, but he clawed his way upward, inch by terrible inch, until he lay panting on a bed of slick leaves and mud, half in the water, half out. He rolled onto his back, vomiting river water. The sky above was a dull, featureless gray. He was alive. For now. He pushed himself up onto his elbows and looked back at the river. The pale tendrils were gone, retracted back into the depths. The surface was deceptively calm. He was on the wrong side, the side opposite from where he had fled the bunker. This part of the forest was unfamiliar, darker, the trees older and more densely packed. He was alone, weaponless, soaked to the bone, and shivering uncontrollably. He had traded the certain doom of the bunker for a slow, cold death in an even more unknown part of the woods. He struggled to his feet, his body racked with tremors. He had to move, to find shelter, to get warm. He took a stumbling step away from the water's edge, into the shadows of the towering pines. The silence here was different. It was older, deeper. It was the silence of a place that had been waiting for him for a very long time. Ahead, nestled between two massive gnarled roots of a cedar tree, was a small figure. It was a carving no taller than his knee. It was a little girl, her features smoothed by time and weather. But her face was a perfect, sorrowful copy of the photograph Ian had kept. It was Ilara. She was looking directly at him, one wooden hand outstretched, as if in welcome or in warning. The forest had not just absorbed Ian. It had reunited him with his daughter, and it had put her here on this bank, knowing Donovan would come. It had not just been hurting him. It had been guiding him, delivering him to this specific place. He looked from the small, sad statue into the deep gloom of the woods behind it. There, between the trees, he saw them. Dozens of pairs of eyes, not reflecting light, but emitting a soft phosphorescent green glow. They were watching him. They had been waiting. The running was over. The courtship was complete. Thank you for making it all the way to the end and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales, and to help our channel grow. Wishing you a calm, peaceful good night, and I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.